4. Visitors in the night. It must have been very frightening for you. What must have been, doctor? Asked Wahid in his clipped Punjabi accent. Well, your GP says in her letter that you thought you saw some people in your bedroom in the middle of the night. He hesitated, glancing away. Doctor, I think I must have been confused when I was speaking to her, he blurted out. Confused? I inquired, studying him intently. Wahid Razak was a tall, lean man, still looking very athletic in his late 50s. He sported a well-trimmed mustache and beard, now graying in places, but meticulously attended to with obvious care and precision. He wore a uniform of some kind, a blue jacket and tie with a red insignia, but I wasn't sure what it was for. Yes, I don't know why I said that to her. I must have been dreaming. The words tumbled out without conviction. I see. So why are you here, Mr. Razak? I asked pointedly. I got the appointment, sir, he explained, opening his hands outstretched in front of him as if to ask what else could he do in response to the summons. I decided to change the subject. You really don't need to call me sir. Where were you born, by the way? Born? Oh, I am from Lahore. Have you ever been? No, I'm afraid not, but I hear from my parents, who spent some time there when they were young, that it is a beautiful city. In fact, I thought it was actually the city where I had been conceived. Indeed, it is the city of Mughal emperors. We are very proud of it. He smiled, now seeming more at ease. It is a wonderful place. Sometimes, I am so sorry to have left it. Lahore had indeed been the center of the Mughal Empire, a thriving city for literature, art and architecture in the 16th and 17th centuries. Years later, it was to become a key city for the British administration of its empire in India. And where are you from, if you don't mind me asking, doctor? He continued. I was born in East Pakistan, when it was called that. Now, of course, it is Bangladesh. Never mind, said Wahid. We still accept you. Once a Pakistani, always a Pakistani, he added with a grin. Although this was presumably a heartfelt joke, Wahid would have very clearly understood that, in reality, once a Pakistani didn't mean you always remained a Pakistani at all. The state of Pakistan had been created in the rushed, some might say bungled, dissolution of British colonial rule of India in 1947. What was then British India had been partitioned so that Muslim communities in the east and west of the region would live in a single state, but the two parts of this state, East and West Pakistan, were separated by nearly 1,000 miles, with the modern country of India, which has a Hindu majority, created between them. The entire process of partition was an artifice with tragic consequences for those caught up in the religious violence that it triggered. In the ensuing chaos, up to 10 million people migrated across the subcontinent, with many Muslims fleeing to the newly formed areas that were under Pakistani rule, and millions of Hindus making their way to India. My father had been born in Bengal at the time of the British Empire and grew up in the region that became East Pakistan. But to receive his training as a radiologist, he had flown nearly 1,000 miles with my mother to live in Lahore, situated in West Pakistan. That is how they had found themselves in the city where Wahid had grown up. East and West Pakistanis, although all mostly Muslims, were from completely different cultural backgrounds. Bengalis living in the East spoke an entirely different language. They had separate social, culinary, musical and literary traditions from people in the West. Inevitably, following a violent war of independence in 1971, East Pakistan split away from West Pakistan to become present-day Bangladesh. One of the legacies of the British Empire was the emigration of People from all over its former colonies. Over 1 million people of Pakistani origin alone now live in the United Kingdom. Like many Punjabis, just one of the ethnic groups from Pakistan, Wahid had come to London in search of work in the 1960s. Life had been extremely difficult for him. Nobody wanted us. We'd get told to take our stinking curries and go home. Eventually, I found a job sweeping the streets. But that wasn't safe. People would spit on me or attack me, apparently for taking their jobs. I couldn't say, but none of you want to do this job. That's why I have it, because that would get me into even more trouble. Eventually, over 30 years ago, he had managed to become a bus driver, and he had stuck to it. You enjoy your job? He sighed. It is very important to me. That's good to hear. Yes, it is. How do you say? My livelihood. Without it, I would be finished. He rubbed his palms over each other in a single flourish to make the point. Suddenly, Wahid's head tilted back, and with his deep brown eyes wide open in seeming disbelief, he stared at the corner of the ceiling, clenching his teeth. Are you all right? I asked as I walked around to the chair he was perched on. I'm really fine, doctor. He turned his gaze towards me, his face quite gaunt. But Wahid wasn't fine. He was still glancing periodically up at the corner. You look worried. What can you see up there? Wahid shook his head. I can't see anything. He paused. Can you see anything there, doctor? Look, I am here to help. I can't see anything odd in the corner. But you looked frightened. Wahid's hands rose to his high cheeks and moved slowly down. Stroking his graying beard, he shook his head again. There were now a few beads of sweat on his forehead. No, I can't really tell you, sir. All that you say here is confidential between us. Mr. Razak, I explained, trying to reassure him. Once more, he stroked his beard with his right hand. Really? Wahid's top lip moved forwards. He hesitated. Yes, and I might be able to help, but I can't do that unless I understand what the problem is. Wahid considered what I had said for a long time. He sighed again. And then came his confession. I have been seeing people. Sometimes animals. They come and go. Sometimes they last for seconds and are gone. Other times they can be there for many minutes. It is worst in the evening or at night. I have woken up to see a group of hooded men looking down at me. As I lay in bed, they just stared. It was very frightening the first time. I don't understand what is happening. What do you see exactly? They are like shadows, dark shapes, but if I look closely, they are people. And do they ever speak to you? What? Oh no. Thank God. No, they don't say anything. Do they ever put thoughts into your mind? Oh no, they don't. They just stare. He paused. Sometimes I have seen things that look like mice or large spiders running over the floor. How often do you see them? Perhaps once a day. I thought I saw a face in that corner up there, he said, pointing to the ceiling. And did you? Yes, I think so. But he was gone very quickly. Do you ever recognize any of the people? Not really. They seem very familiar now because the same ones come back, but I don't know them. And you don't think they are real? Oh no, of course they're not real. Doctor, have you ever seen them when you are driving the bus? Wahid's upper lip moved forwards again. Yes, once, and that is what I am worried about. I saw the dark shadow of a man running to my left, but I knew he wasn't real. It was only for a few seconds. But it makes me worried. What are you most concerned about? He held his head in his hands. That I am going mad. I could understand Wahid's reluctance to tell me about the unusual visitors that came to him in the night. Madness, as the medical historian Roy Porter observed, is probably a condition that is as old as mankind. Point 1. Although defined in many different ways throughout the centuries, one consistent theme has been the othering of people considered to be mad by the rest of society. They are different, often visibly so, and because of this they can be ostracized by people around them. But what Wahid had described up to now were only visual hallucinations, in other words, perceptions experienced in the absence of any external stimulus. Visual hallucinations, on their own, are not sufficient to consider someone to be mad, at least not in Western medical culture. Wahid had not mentioned anything else to suggest either psychotic or disorganized thinking. He showed no evidence of harboring any delusional thoughts, false beliefs that are firmly held on inadequate grounds and that would be unexpected on the basis of someone's cultural background or education. Point 2. He also had insight into his symptoms and their potential significance if people were to find out that he was experiencing hallucinations. None of this pointed to a serious psychiatric diagnosis. I let Wahid speak on about his concerns. As I listened to him talk, it became clear how madness means different things to people from different backgrounds. In my community, madness is not understood. It is not acceptable. Doctor, people think that you must have done terrible things for this to happen to you, he explained. Some of them think you are possessed by a jinn. In some cultures around the world, hallucinations represent a form of demonic possession of the person and the mind. Among Pakistani people, and many other Muslims around the world, there is a belief in jinn, more familiarly referred to as genies in Western literature, considered to be invisible beings. The Arabic meaning of the word jinn is to hide, who live alongside humans as snake-like or other creatures. Jinn are able to change their form at will, and, crucially, can take possession of human beings. By entering a person's body, they can control an individual or alter the way they behave, even change their identity. Point 3. Some Muslims take such possession to be a manifestation of a punishment from God. In South Asian communities in the United Kingdom, many people not only believe in jinn, 80% according to one survey, but also consider them to cause mental illness, 58%. Point 4. To be cured requires the expulsion of the jinn from the body, in part because mental illness carries with it this burden of being possessed by an evil spirit. It is also associated with a huge social stigma in these communities. Little wonder that many in and from Pakistan overtly deny experiencing mental health symptoms and do not seek medical help. Instead, their recourse is to pray or to seek out faith healers willing to perform exorcism. Perhaps these beliefs contribute to the fact that in 2020 there were only 500 psychiatrists in Pakistan caring for patients in a population of 200 million. Point 5. Even in the UK, people originally from South Asia access mental health services with far less frequency than the indigenous population. Point 6. It is perhaps paradoxical how the concept of being possessed by an external force, such as a jinn, is an accepted explanation of mental illness among some communities. For Western psychiatrists, it would be considered to be a delusional belief if a person from a non-Muslim background were to voice such a view. So, a patient's cultural background matters when making a diagnosis. Symptoms such as visual hallucinations can have negative religious or spiritual attributions in some cultures. This may mean that those communities are less likely to be sympathetic to a sufferer than they would be if the illness was considered to be a physical one affecting the brain, such as, for example, a stroke. In the course of our conversation, it turned out that Wahid's wife had died several years ago. He now lived alone, independently. He had 3 children, but they were all grown up and now living with their own families. They came to visit him from time to time. He'd briefly mentioned to them that he had woken up to see people surrounding his bed, but they had brushed these visions off as some kind of strange dream. Wahid didn't have any hobbies, but in his spare time he helped with a local Muslim charity. He'd been very involved with packing tents and sleeping bags for the growing refugee crisis in Syria, more than 2.5 years on from the beginning of that country's civil war. Hundreds of thousands of displaced people were seeking asylum first in Turkey and Jordan, but now also beyond the Middle East. Many were risking their lives in small boat crossings to reach Greece via the Mediterranean Sea. Apart from seeing the people and animals that you know aren't there, do you ever have any other kinds of odd experiences? Not really. Wahid hesitated again, but a few times I have thought, there is someone else in the room to the side or behind me. But as soon as I look, there is nobody there. I am not sure that it is anything important. I don't find that frightening. Wahid was describing what neurologists term a presence phenomenon, the erroneous feeling that another person is in close proximity, also sometimes referred to as an extracampine hallucination, a perception of something outside the perceptual limits of the sensory visual field. Point 7. These type of experiences often provide an important clue as to what the underlying diagnosis might be. Next, I performed the neurological examination. I watched Wahid walking outside the consultation room and down the corridor. His stride length was normal, but it was quite evident that he was not swinging his arms as most people would. Otherwise, his gait and ability to turn was unremarkable. When I asked him to stand still and then gave him a pull from behind, he was able to maintain his balance without difficulty. All the rest of the neurological examination, including the reflexes in his arms and legs, was also normal, except for two small features. First, when I asked him to tap his index finger against his thumb repetitively as fast as he could, he was slow and the amplitude of the movements reduced erratically within a few taps. This was worse in his left hand. Second, when I moved them, there was some mild rigidity at his wrists. Again, it was worse on the left side. The reduction in arm swing when he walked, the slight abnormality of his ability to make tapping movements with his finger and thumb, and the mild rigidity at the wrists were all features of Parkinsonism. Characteristic signs observed in Parkinson's patients, but in Wahid's case they were not sufficiently severe to make a diagnosis of Parkinson's disease itself. Nevertheless, they were a potentially important clue as to what might be causing Wahid's visual and extracampine hallucinations. People with Parkinson's disease have slowness of movement, rigidity and tremor. They lose the swing of their arms when they walk. They may develop poor balance and a stooped posture. However, we now appreciate that there are several neurological conditions which have some of these Parkinsonian features, but which are not Parkinson's disease. I began to wonder if Wahid might have one of these. We performed some screening cognitive tests of Wahid's ability to attend to information, his memory, both short and long-term, as well as tests of language, visual spatial ability, such as copying a drawing, and limb praxis, copying of hand gestures. His only difficulty was with the two kinds of copying. He found both challenging. His copy of a line drawing of a cube, for example, appeared haphazard and inaccurate. I checked his eyes and his vision, but these were both normal. So, what do you think, doctor? Will they lock me up? He asked, slowly and with trepidation. No, I don't think you are mad. These visual hallucinations certainly don't mean that you are mad. Really? Yes, really, I assured him, but we need to do some special scans. to look at your brain, and then we can discuss whether we can help you. You might have some treatment? Yes, I really think so. But we need to do the tests first. I'll see you back here as soon as I get the results. Tilda. As I left the clinic that afternoon, the conversation with Wahid about madness kept recurring in my mind. He had thought that his visual hallucinations were a sign of insanity and that he might be incarcerated because of this. Psychiatrists make a distinction between hallucinations, false perceptions, and delusions, false beliefs. But in some conditions, both symptoms can exist. Many people with schizophrenia, for example, suffer from different types of hallucination, often auditory, hearing voices, as well as delusions, e.g., that they are under the control of an external force or person. However, even healthy people can experience hallucinations under certain circumstances. For example, as many as half of individuals who have recently been bereaved report hallucinations, while other surveys have revealed that up to 10% of otherwise normal people can experience minor hallucinations on a regular basis. They might hear their phone ringing when it isn't, or footsteps coming down a hall when there are none. Why might someone perceive something in the absence of a sensory stimulus? To answer this question, it is important to appreciate that perception is not simply equivalent to a passive receipt of information gathered by our senses. Instead, most neuroscientists consider perception to require an active process of reconstructing the world around us to represent it within the brain. The 19th century German physicist and psychologist Hermann von Helmholtz, who made major contributions in several fields, including that of thermodynamics, was fixated on a key problem in visual perception. How do we perceive what we see? Though our eyes? To Helmholtz, the answer was not obvious. How does the pattern of light falling on the two-dimensional retina, he asked himself, become converted into a rich, three-dimensional representation of the world? This was all the more perplexing because he understood that very similar patterns of stimulation on the retina might be caused by different objects, depending on their orientation and location in space. By its very nature, he correctly surmised, the retinal image is ambiguous. Perception is further complicated by the fact that an object looks very different from various viewpoints. Consider a chair seen from the top, or the side, or the bottom. Despite the pattern of light falling on the retina being very different in these three cases, we nevertheless perceive the same chair. To explain how we solve these challenges in perceiving the world around us, Helmholtz proposed that our brains effectively decide on the most likely solution for which object or objects might be causing the visual sensory impressions on the retina. This type of judgment, Helmholtz argued, occurs by a process he called unconscious inference. 8 By this he meant that our perceptions are actually the result of unconscious assumptions that we automatically make about the world around us. For Helmholtz, perception is not the passive receipt of sensory information, but rather it involves solving the problem of what caused a particular pattern of sensory input by using the observer's knowledge of the environment. Regularities in the external world mean that we can make use of this knowledge to generate the best interpretation of the sensory information around us. For example, the fact that there are more vertically and horizontally orientated objects constrains what kind of object might be out there, or the fact that light comes from above to illuminate the environment means we interpret shadows differently for indented objects compared to protruding ones. Some modern-day neuroscientists who are involved in developing models of the brain have been inspired by Helmholtz's proposal of unconscious inference. They suggest that the brain solves the problem of sensory input by using a generative model of the external world. According to this view, the job of the perceptual system is to act as a sort of statistical inference engine, a device these neuroscientists aptly named a Helmholtz machine. This machine functions to infer the most likely causes of sensory input, given what we know about the environment we are in. Point 9. According to this view, what we perceive is partly based on prior expectation and partly on more immediate sensory input. But this also means that perception can be wrong if the prior probability of something occurring is erroneously taken to be very high. For example, in an experiment where people were told that at some time they are going to hear a particular song, e.g., White Christmas, but are instead played white noise, some of them reported that they could hear Bing Crosby's voice. Intriguingly, schizophrenic patients who hear voices are more susceptible to drawing such erroneous conclusions than those who don't. 10. These considerations have led to the astonishing conclusion that normal visual perception is not like taking a photograph, but is instead an active process in which we generate a model of the world outside. Thus, what we see is mostly about our expectations of what we should see. This means that one way to think about hallucinations is that they are simply erroneous inferences about the environment. People with degraded vision, such as that caused by eye diseases, may suffer from visual hallucinations, a condition known as Charles Bonnet syndrome. This is because they are making incorrect models of the world on the basis of poor or noisy sensory input, but we wouldn't consider them to be mad simply because they are experiencing such hallucinations. Similarly, even if the eyes themselves are working fine, but the parts of the brain that analyze visual information are not functioning properly, then the sensory input may not be effectively processed. And if prior expectations are strong in the face of an individual's imprecise processing of sensory information, then erroneous inferences may be made about the external environment, which can likewise lead to visual hallucinations. 10. Neuroscientists sometimes refer to incoming sensory information, or the processing of that input by the brain, as bottom-up processes. By contrast, prior expectations based on previous knowledge or memory are called top-down processes. Visual hallucinations can occur when top-down influences or prior expectations are strong but bottom-up ones are degraded. Set in this context, Wahid's experience of visitors in the night was an important clue. His hallucinations seemed worse when it was dark, when the sensory input would be most degraded, but his eyes and vision seemed normal, so we couldn't attribute his hallucinations to an eye disorder. In his case, the explanation for his symptoms would therefore be that his brain was having trouble processing the visual input. I certainly didn't have to conclude that Wahid was mad because he was experiencing these visual hallucinations, nor did we have to worry that he was in danger of being placed in an institution because of these symptoms. The MRI scan of Wahid's brain was performed a few weeks later. Its results did not reveal a diagnosis. However, I had also requested a different type of investigation called a DAT, dopamine transporter scan, which is a way to assess dopamine-containing neurons within the brain. The outcome of this scan was definitely abnormal. It showed that Wahid had lost some of the dopamine neurons in his basal ganglia in a pattern that is characteristic of two closely related brain diseases. One is Parkinson's disease and the other is dementia, with Lewy bodies, DLB, after Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia. DLB is one of the commonest causes of cognitive impairment in older people. Both Parkinson's and DLB are associated with the accumulation of Lewy bodies within neurons. These are abnormal aggregates of protein that have clumped together inside nerve cells. They can be seen through a microscope and were first observed by Fritz Louis in 1910 when he was studying the brains of patients who had suffered from Parkinson's disease, or paralysis agitans, as it was then known. 11 Remarkably, Louis was working in Alzheimer's laboratory in Munich when he made his discovery. Thus, two very important pathologies underlying neurodegenerative diseases in Parkinson's disease, DLB, and Alzheimer's disease were discovered within the same room by researchers in the same group within 5 years of each other. We now know that Lewy bodies contain a protein called alpha-synuclein, whereas amyloid and tau proteins accumulate in the brains of people with Alzheimer's disease. Alpha-synuclein aggregation in the form of Lewy bodies is the hallmark pathology of Parkinson's disease and of DLB. 12 In both of these conditions there can be visual hallucinations, fluctuating attention, and some degree of cognitive impairment, including difficulties with copying line drawings, constructional apraxia, while Parkinson's disease is associated with motor symptoms such as slowness of movement, rigidity, and tremor. None of these have to be present to make a diagnosis of DLB. Nevertheless, people with DLB usually have some mild features of Parkinsonism, and these may become more prominent over time. Many neurologists consider Parkinson's disease and DLB to be two ends of a spectrum of conditions associated with the accumulation of Lewy bodies in the brain. 13 When I had examined him, Wahid had some clinical signs consistent with very mild Parkinsonism: reduced arm swing when he walked, some slowing of finger movements, and a little rigidity at his wrists. These features, combined with his visual hallucinations and mild cognitive impairments, all pointed to a clinical diagnosis of DLB. We now had an explanation for Wahid's symptoms. A few weeks later, Wahid returned to the clinic. He seemed very different. His face was hollowed, the skin around his eyes now intensely dark, and his gaze was directed to the floor. "How are you?" "Not very well, doctor. I have seen more of these people, mostly at night. I'm not sleeping well. My children are very upset," he said slowly. "I'm very sorry to hear that. What has happened with your children? I thought you said they hadn't been too concerned." "They've now been with me on some evenings when I have had these hallucinations. At first, they didn't believe that I was seeing anything, but then they saw how disturbed I looked. They know that I am having scans, and when I got your letter saying that the MRI had been normal, I showed it to them. I could see on their faces that they think this means I must be going mad. You might be jumping to conclusions. Perhaps? I don't think so. Normally, they would take me along to some community events or parties. They haven't invited me to anything in the last few weeks. I think they would be ashamed of me." "Look, Mr. Razak," I assured him, "you are not going mad. I think we have an explanation for the hallucinations." "You do?" There was a curious, hesitant excitement in his voice. "Yes, the second scan you had, the DAT scan, was not normal. It tells us that you might have a condition called Lewy body disease." I avoided using the term dementia with Lewy bodies because I knew this would generate more anxiety and, in truth, although the condition was given that name, Wahid wasn't demented. He had some mild cognitive changes, but he did not reach the clinical criterion for dementia, which would require his cognitive impairment to be severe enough to cause problems with everyday life. He was living independently. "I have never heard of this Lewy body thing. What does it mean?" I explained a little about the condition and focused on the treatment. "The good news is that we can give you some medication which might help with the hallucinations. Really? You think it might get rid of them? I can't guarantee that, but we can certainly try. I gave him a prescription for ribostigmine, a drug that boosts the levels of acetylcholine in the brain. Like dopamine, this is a neurotransmitter used by nerves to signal to each other. Research on people with DLB has revealed that, in addition to the loss of dopamine, there can be a severe depletion of acetylcholine in their brains. 14 Elevating the levels of this chemical in the brain, therefore, may improve communication between neurons and, consequently, with sensory perceptions. We now know that those patients with DLB who experience visual hallucinations rely more on their prior expectations than what is actually present in the visual scene. 15. Brain imaging has also shown that the connections between cortical areas involved in processing visual information, especially about objects, are not as strong in these people. 16. Fig. 11. Brain regions involved in processing visual information. Information from the eyes is transmitted via the optic nerve to the occipital lobe. From there it passes along two major cortical systems. One of these systems, top arrow, consists of a set of connections up to the parietal cortex. This is important for knowing where objects are around us. The other system, bottom arrow, takes visual information to the temporal lobe, which is responsible for object perception. When connections between cortical regions in these two streams of information are degraded, visual processing of inputs from the eyes is weaker. For people suffering from such degraded bottom-up processes, sensory evidence is even worse when the visual environment is dark. They may rely more on their top-down prior expectations of what should be in the visual scene, but their inferences can be wrong, leading to visual hallucinations. Visual input from the eyes first reaches the cortex of the occipital lobe in the back of the brain. Fig. 11. From there, visual information is processed in two major cortical systems, one going up to the parietal cortex, important for visual spatial functions enabling perception of the locations of where things are around us, and the other going down to the temporal lobe, crucial for the perception of objects. When connections between cortical regions in these two major systems are degraded, as occurs in DLB, processing of incoming visual information from the eyes is weaker. People with DLB and hallucinations are likely, therefore, to rely more on top-down processing of prior expectations and less on bottom-up processing of incoming visual information. By boosting acetylcholine, it might be possible to strengthen the connections between brain regions, including those involved in processing visual information. We will start at the low dose and see how things are going in a few weeks' time. Thank you, he responded, a smile crossing his face. We also have to discuss work and driving. Wahid looked alarmed. I have to stop working? Not necessarily, but I think you have to discuss the diagnosis with your occupational health team who will contact me. You will also have to let the driving authority and your insurance company know. But they will take away my license. He frowned, now clearly very upset. No, that doesn't have to happen, because your symptoms are not so severe, but you might have to take a driving assessment. And if the medication is effective, that might improve your condition. The problem is that if you don't inform people, there might be serious consequences. Oh no, I will lose everything if I can't drive. Doctor, as I say, you won't necessarily have to stop driving, and I will explain what I have found to support you. Wahid hesitated. You really don't think I'm going mad? Then? Please be honest. Doctor, I am very worried that I'll be locked up in a madhouse. I certainly don't think that will happen, Mr. Rizak, and I honestly don't think you are mad, I said, trying to be as definitive and reassuring as possible. There was a long pause as Wahid considered my words. Thank you. I really appreciate all you have done. Wahid left the consulting room, concerned but also holding out hope for a solution. The door shut behind him and I was about to start my letter to Wahid's GP, but something in the way that he had expressed his distress over being put away in a madhouse made me stop. Wahid's concerns disconcertingly brought back memories of a surprise that I had encountered several years ago on a historical tour of the city of London, the financial heart of the capital. It was on this tour that I first came across the site of Bethlehem, which for centuries had been London's notorious hospital for the insane, the biggest madhouse the city had ever built. The tour guide's account had embedded into my own mind some shocking imagery of how Londoners had dealt with people who they had considered to be mad, and what the causes of their insanity were imagined to be. Originally founded in 1247, Bethlehem Hospital, soon shortened to Bethlehem, had first been located in Bishopsgate. We were told, as early as the 14th century it was a place known for housing the mad, the outcasts of London. It was where people who didn't belong, sometimes simply because their behavior didn't conform to society's expectations, were interned. Bethlehem was soon being referred to as Bedlam, a word synonymous with the pandemonium inside its walls, because the burgeoning need to house the lunatics had outgrown its original confines. The hospital moved in 1676 into an imposing new building in Moorfields by London Wall, a street that marks the location of the old city wall. It was here that our guide had stopped to point out its location, just by present-day Finsbury Gardens. In Georgian times, she explained, the governors of Bethlehem actively encouraged visitors to come view the patients, even if they had no connection to the institution's inhabitants. Presenting the misfortunate in this way was an important means by which Bethlehem elicited donations, a fundraiser of sorts. The spectacle could also be framed as moral instruction for the public. The disturbed folk housed in Bethlehem were a cautionary reminder of where vice and degenerate behavior might lead. But, as I later read, what also drew people to gawk at the poor inmates was the frisson of the freak show. Point 17 Here the Georgian public witnessed all that there was to offer in Bedlam, the chaos and vulgarity of the mad as a spectacle. This was othering on a showground scale, an example of what they might have encountered. Our guide went on to say, is depicted in the last scene of A Rake's Progress, a satirical series of paintings by William Hogarth. The story told across these portrayals is of the life of the reprobate Tom Rakewell, a man whose depraved lifestyle, gambling, prostitution and debauchery, ultimately leads to ruin, culminating first in his internment in the squalor of the Fleet prison, used mainly for debtors and bankrupts, and then confinement at Bethlehem. In this last scene, set in a filthy cell in the hospital, he is hardly recognizable from his previous dandy form, half naked, his head shaven and his leg manacled. His face is in a contorted grimace, and around him are other examples of his fellow inmates, including rather presciently the figure of a king, naked and wearing a crown on his head as he urinates in his cell. As our tour guide explained, the numbers attending Bethlehem to ogle at its inhabitants were particularly large on the holidays at Easter, Whitsun and Christmas. It was almost like a visit to the zoo. The crowds would jostle to get the best sightings, shouting, cajoling, and even prodding the afflicted. The period of viewings reached its peak under the directorship of the hospital by John Monroe, one of a family dynasty of mad doctors, the name given to physicians tending to its residents, who oversaw Bethlehem for 125 years. 18. When in 1788, King George III became seriously unwell and many thought he was incurably insane, the royal doctors wrote to Monroe for his opinion. He proved to be wholly indecisive on the matter. 18. Instead, Monroe's son Thomas was requested to attend. King George, paradoxically, rather sensibly, would have none of it, and proved to be extremely reluctant to be treated by a doctor from the infamous Bethlehem. By then, though, the king's behavior had deteriorated dramatically. At times he was extremely agitated, speaking rapidly, almost as if delirious, and difficult to reason with. On other occasions, although he seemed calm, he would soon begin to express delusional thoughts, convinced, for example, that London had been flooded and that he was the cause. He wrote bizarre letters and insisted that honors should be bestowed on anyone who approached him. 19. He hardly slept and also experienced visual hallucinations and misperceptions. On one occasion, for example, he was observed to be trying to shake hands with an oak tree while talking to it, seemingly believing it to be the King of Prussia. However, the royal doctors could not agree among themselves on whether he was insane, let alone if he was incurable. 20. Was the king's behavior sufficient to conclude that he was now mad for the rest of his life, or had it been triggered by some physical illness that would pass, or might even be treatable? Hogarth's satirical engraving of physicians ruminating over a puzzling case, entitled The Company of Undertakers, captures the widespread sentiment of the time that much of Georgian medicine was performed by medical experts who were no better than quacks. As the king's illness continued without showing any signs of abating, the pressure on the royal physicians increased daily, both from the king's household, including Queen Charlotte, and from the government, whose political fate was tied to that of the survival of the monarch, should the king be pronounced permanently insane, thereby triggering the coronation of his son, the Prince Regent. Or was there hope of recovery? Nobody knew. Ultimately, it was decided to bring in the services of a physician not associated with Bethlehem, Francis Willis, under whose care, as we learned in Chapter 1, the king did get better. His improvement triggered further pronouncements by different doctors that he couldn't possibly be insane. This must have been a physical illness, they declared. And, indeed, the question of whether mental illness has an underlying physical cause has a long history. Modern biological views of psychiatric illnesses, such as schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, would argue that all of these must ultimately have a physical, neural basis. 21. How could they not? So, the distinction between physical and mental illnesses is in some ways artificial. But this is to take a very deterministic view. Others, like Michel Foucault, philosopher and historian, have radically reframed madness as a construct imposed over the ages by society on people who simply behave differently to the rest of us. 22. In Foucault's view, people who don't fit are the ones who have been labeled as insane. He traces the history of madness from medieval times through to what he terms the Great Confinement, the development in 17th-century Europe of incarceration of the insane as a means to segregate these people who, just like vagrants, blasphemers or prostitutes, were best kept separate. In Foucault's view, Christian societies considered all these groups to be in moral error for having chosen their way of life. They needed to be cast out but also given an opportunity to reform in asylums, the great hospitals that sprang up across Europe at that time. This is how the modern madhouses started, and our views of them have not been helped by more recent representations in films, such as One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. I could understand how Wahid was very apprehensive over the prospect of any form of confinement because of his symptoms. Who wouldn't be? Tilda. A few weeks later, Wahid returned to the clinic, but this time with a smartly dressed young woman who bore a striking resemblance to him, with very high-set cheekbones, framed by straight, lustrous, black hair. Her pale face had a peculiarly angular haughtiness to it. She scrutinized me intently through tawny brown eyes. "This is my eldest daughter, Yasmin. She is an accountant," he explained, broadening his lips with a hint of pride. "Good to meet you. And how have you been, Mr. Razak?" He didn't get a chance to reply. "He is not at all well. Are you sure you have the right diagnosis, doctor?" she asked curtly. This was not going to be an easy consultation. "What's been happening, Mr. Razak?" Yasmin answered for him again. "He is still seeing these awful things at night. There are people around his bed, mice running over the floor. The medicine you gave him hasn't done a thing," she said, her voice rising as she spoke. Her father looked despondent. "His work has put him on sick leave and he's not eating properly." Yasmin continued, "Are you really sure he has this Lewy body disease?" Yasmin was clearly not convinced. I tried to slow the pace of the conversation and give Wahid a chance to speak. "I'm really very sorry to hear that, Mr. Razak. Tell me what's been happening." "Yasmin is right. I am really no better, doctor, and they have asked me to go on sick leave for the time being. I've tried to get more involved with the charity I work for, but even they have asked me not to come when they realized that I was having hallucinations. I feel useless," he concluded in a low voice, utterly dejected. Yasmin looked angry. "Is there nothing better you can offer him?" she asked. "We're desperate. My father is losing all his self-respect. He is no longer the man he was. People don't see him. Our family friends in the community aren't calling. You know how superstitious they are about things like hallucinations. Dad is very isolated. I have had to bring him to our house. He's now living with me and my family because I'm worried about the way he is. I understand this is very difficult for all of you. We have only started the medication at the lowest dose. Have you experienced any side effects, Mr. Razak?" "No, I don't have any side effects. But it isn't doing anything either." A medical friend of mine was surprised that he is not on an antipsychotic drug for these hallucinations, added Yasmin. "Wouldn't that be better? I am more than 95% confident that the diagnosis is Lewy body disease," I said. "Antipsychotics can actually make people with this condition dangerously ill, so we avoid those if we possibly can. The medication I have given your father does help most patients, but not everyone, and certainly not always at the low dose, so we need to give it a chance and increase the dose slowly." "So, you're not 100% sure it is this Lewy body thing?" Yasmin snapped. "It is difficult to explain to patients and their families that with brain disorders it is often impossible to be absolutely certain of the diagnosis. To be that confident, we would need to look at a sample of your father's brain under the microscope to see if he had Lewy bodies. And the only way we could do that would be with a biopsy of the brain. That's a procedure that can be risky and is reserved only for cases where the diagnosis is not at all clear from the clinical assessments and investigations. In your father's case, the visual hallucinations, neurological examination and the DAT scan result all make it extremely likely that this is the diagnosis." "But not certain?" persisted Yasmin. "That's right, not certain. Could we have a second opinion?" Then, Yasmin continued. Her father looked at her, embarrassed. In his eyes, she was challenging my authority. "Yasmin, don't speak to the doctor like this," he chided. "What? There's nothing wrong in asking for someone else's view. Abba, Yasmin responded quickly. No, there isn't any problem with that. I can write to a colleague to arrange it. But, meanwhile, I would like you to try a higher dose of the rivastigmine medication. Would you be willing to do that? I asked Wahid. The only way we can find out whether the tablets will help is to slowly go up in dose. Wahid nodded his head. Yes, I will try. Yasmin frowned with skepticism. How long do we have to try for? Please bear with me. Sometimes it can take weeks or even months, but we have to give it a go to see if your father can benefit. If we stopped it now, we would never know if he might have improved. Yasmin's expression made it clear that she didn't have much confidence. Is there no other treatment? My friend told me about deep brain stimulation. Why isn't my dad being offered that? I couldn't help raising my eyebrows. Yasmin was referring to the neurosurgical technique of inserting electrodes deep within the brain, into the basal ganglia. It had been shown that electrical stimulation of these electrodes could improve movements in some people with Parkinson's disease. Patients became faster and less rigid. However, there wasn't any convincing evidence at that time that such a procedure could treat visual hallucinations. It was, nevertheless, a remarkable new advance in treatment for brain disorders and has since been used in a research setting to investigate whether it might improve some of the non-motor symptoms in both Lewy body disease and Parkinson's disease. I'm afraid that deep brain stimulation is not being used to treat hallucinations, I explained. Even if it were, this would take months of assessment and planning. It's important that we try to treat your dad right now, so let's increase the dose of the drug and I'll see you again in a few weeks. I really hope that the higher dose of the rivastigmine would make a difference for Wahid. He was so very distressed, as evidently were his family. The words of his daughter stuck particularly in my mind. That evening, as I tell our medical students, we carry our patients' problems home with us. Yasmin had been very frustrated, but it wasn't her request for a second opinion that was bothering me. She had pointed to something else that was important. Her father was no longer the man he used to be, and people didn't want to see him because they were superstitious about his symptoms. The experience of suffering from visual hallucinations was seemingly sufficient to trigger his increasing isolation. The things that mattered to him in his daily life, his job, his voluntary work for a charity, and his links with his community, had dissolved over a few months. Maybe they hadn't gone forever, but for the time being at least they had disappeared. Why? The work concerns were understandable. The bus company needed time to obtain medical reports and driving assessments. Unless there was some resolution of his symptoms or a plan for the future, his diagnosis was always going to challenge his ability to continue to work as a bus driver. Perhaps the same might also be said for the charity's response. But the loss of connections with members of his own community couldn't be attributed to that. One of the most impressive qualities of immigrant groups from South Asia living in the UK has been the mutual support people give to each other in difficult times, including when members of their community fall ill. Families rally around, offer to help look after the children, cook meals, or are simply able to be there to comfort the sufferer. Although there are now third or fourth generation migrants from Pakistan, these communities often still remain outsiders in many ways. For many, acculturation, the process of learning and assimilating the values and customs of the host country, including behaviors that affect health, has not been substantial. As John Barry, a Canadian social psychologist who has studied the trajectories that migrants take, has observed, while some groups integrate Others rarely interact with the host community. Point 23 Instead, they stay separate, within the boundaries of their own social group. In so doing, they need to stick together to confront challenges such as ill health within members of their community. But what had happened to lead to Wahid's near abandonment and sense of exclusion when he became unwell? He hadn't announced he was sick, but Wahid's responses to his visual hallucinations had been observed by people in his community. They soon realized the nature of his symptoms and had made judgments about what that meant. It wasn't necessarily the case that they thought he was possessed, but the knowledge that he was experiencing hallucinations was sufficient for them to shun him. A month later, as I looked down my clinic list to see who was coming that day, I saw that Wahid was due back. I was dreading it. If he hadn't improved, there was likely to be another very awkward conversation with his daughter. I would have to hold my ground and try to convince them both that we needed to increase the dose of rivastigmine even further. Persuading them to take this route would mean a far more difficult conversation than the one we'd had previously. As anticipated, Wahid came with his daughter, Yasmin. Her mouth was already half open to speak before she had even got in through the door, and her eyes immediately fixed me with a grave intensity. But it was her father this time who beat her to opening the conversation before I had welcomed him in. "Doctor, it has been marvelous. The higher dose has worked. I am so very pleased. No more of these terrible things coming to visit me in the night." I was taken aback. "That is fantastic, Mr. Razak. Quite wonderful." But before I had any opportunity to enjoy the moment with her father, Yasmin interjected and, to my surprise, she was grudgingly appreciative. "I'm sorry for being so difficult the last time," she explained. "You can understand that I was just worried about Dad and, frankly, I didn't really expect much from this medication." With an expression of slight self-reproach, she went on, "I was wrong. Thank you for explaining things clearly. I should have trusted you. He really is a very different man, and I know that it is down to your help." This was not what I had expected, but it was very gratifying. "I understand that you were stressed. I am so pleased your father has responded well," is all I could say. We often don't know whether a drug will work for any given individual patient. To learn that rivastigmine had made such a difference was really pleasing to hear. It had apparently taken a week or so before the higher dose of the drug had its effect. But now Wahid was completely free of visual hallucinations. It is in some ways remarkable that a drug that boosts the level of a specific chemical in the brain, the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, can achieve this. As I was to find out, it had effectively turned someone who might well have been considered mad in years gone by, or even in some communities today, into a person who was acceptable. We now know that many patients with Wahid's condition can obtain substantial benefits, including improvements in cognitive functions and resolution of visual hallucinations, with rivastigmine and other drugs that increase acetylcholine in the brain. 24. Intriguingly, the major source of neurons that use acetylcholine as their neurotransmitter emanate from a tiny brain region called the nucleus basilis of Maynard, or NBM for short. One function of acetylcholine is to amplify signals transmitted across neurons. Rivastigmine might strengthen the connectivity between cortical areas involved in processing incoming visual information, which are weak in Lewy body disease. 16. In this way, it may help to enhance visual perception, and thereby also reduce the reliance on prior expectations in these patients. 15. In recent years, neurologists have begun to research whether electrical stimulation of the NBM can also improve cognitive and neuropsychiatric symptoms such as visual hallucinations. These pioneering deep brain stimulation studies have shown that, at least in some patients, there can be significant benefits. 26. The same technique is also now being tested in Alzheimer's disease. Buoyed by the improvement in his symptoms, Wahid had summoned up sufficient courage to revisit his occupational health team. They had said that they'd like to see whether he remained free of hallucinations over the next 2 weeks. They also wanted a report from me before making a decision on whether he might return in some capacity to work. In the meantime, without prompting, Wahid had arranged a driving assessment, which he had passed without any difficulty. Most pleasingly for him, he had been offered a place again as a volunteer back at the charity that was so dear to him. Yasmin had also made a big effort to contact his family friends. She had reassured them that her father was much better now on his appropriate medical treatment to reduce the stigma associated with his symptoms. She had apparently had to emphasize that he had been seen by a medic, a neurologist, not a psychiatrist. 3 weeks ago, Wahid had moved back to his own house. Yasmin felt that he was now far less vulnerable, and it was important for him, she felt, to regain his independence. Some of his friends had started to call around and he was enjoying their company, even being invited to community events once they had seen that he appeared to be back to his normal self. Wahid's story wasn't over, but the beginning had changed. There were no more visitors in the night. 5. Neglecting me quietly. The light was fading fast over Portobello. It had been a grand evening. The deep violet of the West London sky was scratched with a lush ruby red at its lowest edge as the sun slowly waned on the horizon, announcing the end of a long, scalding summer's day, the kind that had rarely frequented the city that year. People were making the most of it, and where better than in Notting Hill? The pubs were overflowing with customers stacked 2 or 3 deep on the pavement, most in a radiant mood, revived by both the heat of the day and London's finest ales. Their good humor and laughter stretched far along the streets. It was then, apparently, that Winston had been found. At first sight, he had simply been having too much of a good time, twisting and turning in his old pinstriped charcoal suit. Onlookers would have assumed that he was probably a little worse for wear, attempting to dance to the beat of the distant reggae tracks of Burning Spear, booming from somewhere near the Westway. He was shouting something, but then so were many others. It wasn't clear what he was saying, his Caribbean lilt distorted by a slight slurring of his speech. No doubt this might also be attributed to the cumulative effect of the libations enjoyed throughout the day. When his friend Kelvin bumped into him, Winston didn't seem to see him at first. He appeared somehow bewildered, peculiarly dazed. In the growing darkness, although Kelvin had crossed over the street, greeting him as he approached, Winston's gaze was firmly turned away from him, attempting to find the owner of the voice, which had called out his name. Even when Kelvin was straight in front of him, Winston didn't appear to see him, turning rightwards, away from him in an attempt to locate him. "Is that you, Kelvin man?" Winston had asked. He seemed disorientated, unsure of where he was even though this was his neighborhood. Kelvin was concerned. "You okay, Winston?" he had asked. "Been drinking already?" But Winston was adamant that he hadn't, and there certainly wasn't any smell of alcohol on him. "Me need a piss, though," he said. Kelvin had put his arm through Winston's and walked with him to the nearest pub, the Elgin, at the corner of Ladbroke Grove. The place was well known to them both, so once inside, he'd let Winston go ahead towards the toilets while he went to the bar. But just as he was about to order 2 pints, he heard a terrible crash. As he turned, he saw that Winston had apparently collided with a woman carrying some glasses. Both were now entangled on the floor with people trying to help them up. Jesus, Winston! Kelvin had rushed over, apologizing for his friend as he slowly pulled him up. It became evident, though, that Winston must have been heading in the wrong direction, back towards the front doors, rather than the toilets. Once the commotion had died down, he decided to guide Winston to the toilets himself. He was now even more concerned that all was not well. They both went into the lavatories and Winston headed over to the urinals. But to Kelvin's horror, he saw his friend unzipping and pissing straight into the sink. The other men there shouted that he should take his drunk friend away. Hadn't he caused enough trouble already? Although Kelvin had insisted that Winston wasn't drunk, he decided to heed their advice and shepherded him to the bar. Convinced that Winston must be ill, he asked the owner to call for an ambulance while he sat his friend down in a corner. Kelvin, man, stop making a fuss. Me all right, just let me go home. Winston had apparently complained, but Kelvin wouldn't have any of it and managed to persuade him to stay. When they arrived at the emergency department of the hospital, they were confronted by a very long queue. So, your friend's confused, huh? The triage nurse had asked, nodding her head with disapproval, peering down her spectacles with obvious skepticism. She'd seen many confused patients that evening and didn't believe Kelvin when he protested that no alcohol was involved, and so they waited to be seen by a doctor. When eventually the moment arrived, some 5 hours later, nearer dawn, then dusk, the young man who assessed Winston decided to send off some blood tests to see if there might be a reason for his delirium, for that is what he concluded must be the diagnosis. Winston, as previously, seemed to be somehow dislocated from his surroundings, not being able to cooperate with the physical examination, always turning his head, as if distracted and looking for something. I'm afraid it'll take a couple of hours before we get some of these blood tests back, the young doctor said. If, as you say, he hasn't taken anything, it's possible he has an infection. His chest sounds clear, though. We'll get the nurse to take a sample of his urine. The blood tests may also help us work out if he's caught a bug. So, they waited further, Winston falling asleep on his friend's patient's shoulder. The sights and sounds of the emergency department at that time of night can seem like a circus. Kelvin, unable to doze off, might have observed some of the regulars that passed through its doors. Overnight, there might have been Will, the musician who always wore a bright orange suit, wheeling in his double bass confidently past the receptionist, seemingly perfectly well but explaining to all around him that he was in pain and needed his oxycodone if he was to make it through the night. Or else young Jade, who, intent on avoiding the attentions of several dubious men, had arrived once again with complaints of abdominal pain which never did materialize into a firm diagnosis, or homeless Karen with her shopping trolley full of her worldly possessions, feeling unsafe to be out on an evening when so many people were drunk, even if it was warm. All the richness of humanity passed through the emergency department. At night, that morning was my turn to do hospital rounds with the junior neurologist, Nikki, who was on call. I'd got to know her only over the last couple of weeks. My first impression had been that she was efficient more than enthusiastic, a doctor who liked to tick jobs off rather than become engrossed in the problems that people presented with. Even though it was early, she already had a long list of patients referred to us by the medical and surgical teams over the Last 24 hours for neurological opinions. Let's start with the emergency department. I suggested. We can probably help them clear a few of their cases quickly. Okay, the first one's a 70-year-old with acute confusion, she observed, rolling her eyes upwards with a deliberate look of derision. Confusion is a term often used by doctors, but it is usually not very helpful. It obscures what might be the underlying cause. For a neurologist, the question is really whether there is a generalized process such as an infection or the effects of a drug, electrolyte, salt, or metabolic disturbance that is causing someone to be delirious because of a global brain dysfunction, or whether instead there is a distinct focal brain injury that might make someone appear to be confused when they aren't. For example, if a patient had a language impairment, they might sound very confused, when the underlying cause might actually be incomprehension or in speaking. Well, let's see him, then, I agreed. Tilda. When we got to the emergency department, Winston was behind the curtain in a small bay, lying on a trolley, a euphemism for a skeletal mobile bed. He was clearly unhappy being there, as he explained to Kelvin in very robust terms in his Jamaican patois. Why you bring me here, man? Nothing not happening. Doctors. Dem not doing nothing. Understand me? Winston, look, here are some docs now, Kelvin said soothingly as we approached. Where? I don't see no docs, Winston retorted, turning to his right. Straight in front of you. Man, look over here. Kelvin tried to point out. Yes, we're here to see you. Mr. O'Hara. It is Mr. O'Hara, right? Nikki asked, questioning whether we had got to the right patient. That's me all right, Winston O'Hara. You expectin' someone white, Doc? Winston grinned, his head turned to the right. Everyone does. My ancestors are Irish Jamaicans, just like Bob Marley's. Bet y'all didn't know that? Yes, Marley was Jamaican Irish all right, he said, with a laugh. So were Marcus Garvey's ancestors. No? I asked. Well, we got a smart one here. Winston smiled, nodding his head. Quite right, Doc. Now y'all smart enough to figure out why me can't go home? He seemed in good spirits despite his long stay in the emergency department. Winston's face was extraordinarily youthful for someone in his 70s. His skin, a radiant light coffee, was hardly lined. The only thing that might give away his age was the white, curly knots of his hair, trimmed short, and a striking contrast to his skin. We tried to take the history of his admission from Winston, but now getting more impatient and disgruntled, he insisted there was nothing wrong with him. He'd just gone out for the evening to enjoy himself, he said, but somehow things seemed peculiar. He couldn't put his finger on it, but they weren't right, but he was sure a proper night's sleep would sort it all out. We got far more from Kelvin. He related to us the details of the night, how he'd found his friend walking bewildered in Notting Hill, how he'd taken him to the pub, but was shocked at how oddly he'd behaved in the gents. Y'all prone to exaggeration. Man, Winston huffed. Kelvin said he'd have to go home to pick up a few things for his friend, but he'd back later. Winston was not amused. Y'all better make sure y'all do come back, y'all know. Kelvin, don't leave me here. Y'all, hear what I say. I asked Nikki to examine Winston neurologically while I watched. She was thorough, moving smoothly from examining his visual fields, testing whether he had any loss of vision, through the rest of the cranial nerves, the movements of his eyes, face, tongue and neck, and sensation over his face, to testing his arms and legs, power, sensation and reflexes. All seems normal, she concluded as she finished, shrugging her shoulders. I don't think there is a neurological cause for the confusion. Shall we just say, not for us? She was clearly keen to wash her hands of this confused patient. To cross him off our list. It was true that her examination hadn't revealed anything abnormal, but something in Winston's manner, the way he kept turning his head to the right, rang alarm bells. Let's just see how Mr. O'Hara walks, I suggested. Winston fairly jumped off his bed, eager to show us that he was fit to be discharged, and drew the curtains back. Me walk just fine, he said as he headed off. And he did move. Well, but within a few steps he had veered so much to his right as he headed down the congested corridor that he was bumping into trolleys parked by the wall. I can see why they thought he was drunk, Nikki observed wryly, as she studied his attempts to unravel himself from the curtain of one of the other examination bays. Don't you think it's interesting that he's always turning to his right, though? I asked. We brought Winston back. I sat him down on a chair. Can I get you to take a look at this newspaper? I asked. Tell us. What's been happening in the world? Are there any interesting stories? Here, I asked as I picked up and unfurled in front of him a creased copy of the paper. It was the Daily Mail, one of the UK's notorious tabloid newspapers, which happened to have been left by a previous occupant of this examination bay. He'd be lucky to find anything interesting in this rag, I thought to myself, but let's see what he does. Winston surprised me by engaging with my request. Well, looks like the Americans are bombing those Islamic State fighters in Syria. I really don't understand what that's all about. I gotta say, he was referring to President Obama's response to the taking of American hostages by Islamic State, more than 3 years on from the beginning of the war in Syria. Winston turned the page. Then there's this newspaper guy going to prison for hacking phones of famous people. Serves, I am right. And then 2 boats full of people escaping from Syria have sunk in the Med, with a lot of people dead. It's so sad. He was understanding each of these articles. But what was clear was that he was looking at only the right page of the paper as he turned it, missing out the news items on the left. What about this article? I said, pointing to one on the left-hand side, a report on the effects of the hot weather. Winston now turned towards it and also recounted what it said, but as soon as he finished, his gaze shifted rightwards. Every other story he found spontaneously was on the right side of the newspaper as he turned the pages one by one until he got to the end. Have you got a sheet of paper? I asked Nikki. Fig. 12. Visual search performance. Winston crossed out only lines to the right side of the page, neglecting those on the left. Sure, she replied, handing me one of the medical history sheets she had brought along with her to document our findings. I drew a bunch of short lines across the page, then placed the sheet straight in front of Winston. Offering him my pen, I asked him to cross out all the lines he could see. Unlike most people, he started off crossing lines at the very right of the page. Most people who read left to right will start on the left. He stopped after just half a minute, leaving most of the lines on the left side of the page untouched. Fig. 12. Are you done? I asked. Oh yeah. Now why you AKS me to do this kind of silly thing for? Wilson replied indignantly, as if I had requested a task that a child could do. Thanks for bearing with me, I responded. I turned to Nikki. She was looking down at her feet. Sure got that one wrong, she concluded sheepishly. He's got left-sided inattention, hasn't he? I think he has, I responded. That explains the veering off and turning to the right. He's not confused at all. He's neglecting things to his left. Just at that moment, the young emergency doctor who had referred Winston to us pulled back the curtain to the bay to announce that all the blood tests he'd so far got back were normal. That would be the case. I said. So, what do you think is causing his delirium? I don't think he is delirious. Mr. O'Hara here has had a stroke. What? But he doesn't have any weakness. He doesn't have to, if the stroke didn't affect parts of the brain that are involved in controlling movement. There won't be any weakness, but he does have quite profound left-sided neglect. He's not paying attention to his left. That's why he can't seem to find you when you're talking to him. And that's why he's always looking to his right. Oh, he nodded. Do you think you might arrange for a CT scan of his brain? We'll come back later to review the results. I turned to Winston. As I continued, Mr. O'Hara, I'm afraid I think you might have suffered a small stroke that's making it difficult for you to be aware of things too. You're left. We're going to arrange for a scan of your brain to see if that's the case, but I'm afraid it wouldn't be safe for you to go home yet. A stroke? Winston replied, obviously surprised and also skeptical about my diagnosis. You sure, Doc? I can't be absolutely sure. Of course, so let's wait for the scan. I was obviously not impressing him with my diagnostic skills. As we left the emergency department, Nikki said, I feel stupid for missing the inattention. It was obvious, wasn't it? Only if you've seen it before. I reassured her. Everything's easy in hindsight. You're unlikely to miss this again because now you'll be looking out for it. She smiled. Yes, I sure will. I'll look up the CT scan result as soon as it's done. Where do you think the stroke will be? I inquired, interested to see how well she knew her neurology. Right parietal cortex? Yes, I agree. That's the most likely explanation. And it's unlikely to have encroached as far as the motor cortex or the corticospinal tract, she went on. Otherwise, we'd have found him to have been weak in his left arm and leg. The motor cortex on the right side of the brain controls movements of the left arm and leg through nerve fibers which run in the corticospinal tract. These transmit motor cortex signals to the spinal cord which, in turn, makes the muscles of our arms and legs move in a coordinated fashion via our peripheral nerves. It is truly a remarkable control system. What we had observed with Winston, though, was that his control of movement was not impaired. Instead, he was profoundly inattentive towards his left. He didn't spontaneously look that way. Instead, his gaze was shifted to the right. When people approached him from his left, he appeared distracted because he was trying to find them towards his right. When he walked, he neglected items to his left, sometimes bumping into them. He wasn't blind. He could see all right, as Nikki had demonstrated very convincingly when she had examined his vision. It was just that his attention was drawn to the right, as we'd also observed when he was asked to read stories in the newspaper. The CT scan was performed a few hours later and sure enough it showed a relatively small stroke confined to the right parietal cortex. Many years previously, in the 1940s and 50s, several neurologists had observed and documented the phenomenon of leftward inattention following injury to the right parietal lobe. 1. 2. It has since become evident that such spatial neglect 4 sometimes shortened to neglect is a common disorder following a lesion, damage, to the brain, particularly after a stroke, where a blood vessel may become blocked suddenly by a clot or burst to produce a hemorrhage. 4 Patients with neglect fail to pay attention towards one side of space. But what is attention? Psychologists and neuroscientists have been intrigued by this question for over a century. Our brains are continuously bombarded by information from the external world. Each millisecond our sensory receptors, for vision, hearing, touch, smell and taste, may be activated by varying inputs. Yet our brains have limited capacity They simply cannot process all this information, nor would it be useful for them to do so, because most of the inputs that are continually stimulating our sensory receptors are not very significant for us. For example, the touch of our clothes on our skin surface is continuously present and changes even with the slightest movements, but this is usually not of great relevance. For most of our everyday activities, we don't normally care how our shirt is brushing against our skin. If, on the other hand, we suddenly noticed that a part of our skin was feeling very hot because we had inadvertently moved it close to the flame on a cooker, that would be important. Similarly, for vision, most of the information that is reaching our eyes every millisecond is not very useful, but some of it is. For example, if we were walking down a street where some brickwork was falling from scaffolding, we might need to react speedily to avoid getting hit. Our brains require some means to select the relevant from the irrelevant, and that process has been termed attention. Researchers working on how we process sensory information have long appreciated that we would be swamped by a deluge of information overload if we didn't have such a process of selection. In fact, precisely this issue emerged when Google came up with the idea of its Google Glasses. These would record a person's activity through the entire day so that, even better than a diary, the entirety of our lives would be available for playback. It soon became apparent, however, that most of what we do during a day isn't that interesting, and certainly not worth devoting terabytes of data to store for posterity. Instead, what we might need to capture are just a few crucial episodes during a day, the events that were most significant for us. But which events are those? The process of choosing which information is relevant is given the term selective attention. It is the means by which our brains filter out information that is not useful, to focus instead on the stuff which might be. Some researchers have proposed that because the brain has limited capacity, sensory information needs to compete to be selected. 5. The higher the salience of the sensory input, whether it is sudden heat on our skin or a projectile moving towards us seen in the periphery of our vision, the more likely that we might choose to pay attention to it. Salient stimuli win in the competition for selection, but where we decide to deploy our attention also depends upon our goals at the time. If, in a crowded railway station, we are looking for a friend who has told us that she'll be wearing a red coat, we'd be trying to filter out any color that isn't red and focus on those places in the visual scene that are red. So, attention works by competition, either bottom-up, salience, or top-down, depending upon our goals or what we are seeking to do. 6. The things that win in that competition capture our attention. Many research experiments that have been performed in visual attention have suggested that it can be highly spatially selective. We can attend to one location in space and ignore others. 7. This has led to the view that visual attention is rather like a spotlight beam. It picks out the location in the scene where there is something that might be important. Modern brain scanning studies performed while healthy people have to attend to one or other side of space have revealed that this spotlight mechanism might be directed by the parietal cortex, with the right parietal cortex shifting attention to the left side of space and the left parietal cortex shifting it rightwards. 6. When the parietal cortex is damaged on one side, people fail to direct their attention towards the opposite side of space. In neglect, the visual fields can be intact. Patients can see, just as Nikki had found when she examined Winston, but their natural tendency is to pay attention to objects towards one side of space. So, after right parietal brain injury, such as the stroke that Winston had suffered, Patients neglect the left side of space, attending to items on their right and ignoring those to their left. 8. 9. This situation can be considered as though objects on the right are sharp and highly salient for the brain so that they win in the competition for selection and are attended to, whereas those on the left don't stand out and therefore don't capture the patient's attention. As a result, people such as Winston are not consciously aware of objects to their left, even if a patient with neglect understands that they might not be paying attention to one side of space. They may still fail to orientate themselves fully in that direction. This was the evident. For example, in case of the famous film director Federico Fellini, after his right parietal stroke. 10. A much more severe form of inattention than neglect, which affects both sides of space, was first reported in 1907 by the Hungarian physician Rezo Balint. He was fascinated by a man who first came to see him because he had suddenly become frightened to go out of his house. The patient declared that he was unable to judge where or how far oncoming trams or carriages were from him as he walked out of his home in Budapest. He also complained that he could no longer read a book or newspaper. An initial diagnosis that some doctors had considered was that he was simply suffering from hysteria, some form of psychological condition. Balint, however, was a meticulous clinician. He noticed that if he placed an object straight in front of his patient, the man was aware of it, but that if he showed him two objects, he consistently reported seeing only one of them. Through careful bedside examination, Balint came to the conclusion that his patient had a severe restriction of attention, which meant that he was unaware of any objects either to his left or right, even if they were placed straight ahead of him. His attention was so limited in capacity that he could consciously perceive only one item at any one time, despite the fact that his sensory visual fields seemed intact. Balint's patient also had difficulty moving his eyes towards or reaching visual objects, but this might have been because he didn't know where the objects were in space. This is why he was unable to judge where the trams or carriages were and why he was so frightened to leave his home. It also probably explained his difficulty reading, as he was unable to perceive the position of words on a page. When the man died a few years later, Balint found out at the post-mortem that he conducted that his patient had suffered two strokes, one on either side of the brain, involving the parietal cortex on both the left and right sides of the brain. This led him to conclude that his profound visual inattention, as well as his poor localization of objects around him, must be due to damage of the parietal lobes. The features of his celebrated case were subsequently eponymously termed Balint's syndrome, but hardly anything was known about the mysterious Balint himself. In 1986, curious to discover a little more about him, I traveled to Budapest from Oxford, where I was working for my PhD. Hungary was still behind the Iron Curtain at that time, so I was apprehensive about how my trip to a communist country would unfold. But the Hungarians I met turned out to be very generous, welcoming people. To my surprise, after making a few inquiries, I found that Balint's grandson, Peter, was then professor of physiology at the university. Rather sheepishly, I knocked on the door of his house to be greeted with some degree of bewilderment. He found it difficult to believe that a young brown man claiming to be from England had traveled such a long way to discover more about his grandfather. He was even more perplexed when I explained that there was a syndrome named after him, for apparently the family was completely unaware of his fame. Rezo Balint, it turned out, hadn't been his real name either, but rather he had been born to a German Jewish family with the surname Blair. When they settled in Budapest, It was thought it might be prudent to change the name to a Hungarian one because of the nationalistic sentiments that were so strong at the time. Balint is the Magyar, Hungarian version of Valentine. So the syndrome, named after him, literally translates as Valentine's syndrome. It was when I told Peter that I was hoping to publish the background of his grandfather's celebrated case that he offered me a photo of him. To my knowledge, this is the only one that has ever appeared in print. Which happened when eventually we wrote up his story and that of how he came to report his patient. 11. Balint's notes were the first description of the symptoms that occur with bilateral parietal damage. More were to follow shortly, but this time from studies of young men who had suffered bullet wound injuries in the First World War. The velocity of bullets fired from rifles at that time 12 was fast enough to penetrate the skull, but unlike modern firearms, not so fast that they produced potentially lethal cavitation and shock waves in the brain. 13 As a result, soldiers who were unfortunate enough to be shot in the head could survive, and they proved to be an invaluable source of understanding the localization of brain function. Most prominent among the accounts of bullet wound injuries were those of the British neurologist Gordon Holmes, then attached to the British Expeditionary Force in France, stationed in the field hospital in Boulogne. Holmes was attending every day to up to 300 wounded young soldiers brought back from the front line trenches, despite the extremely arduous conditions in which he was working. Holmes managed to examine and, most remarkably, carefully record his observations. What soon became evident was that the design of the Brodie Tommy helmets worn by the British soldiers had a crucial design flaw. Although cheap and easy to manufacture from a single stamping of metal, they sat high on the head, exposing the back of the skull. Holmes's descriptions of young men with focal bullet injuries during the war led him to make some of the most important contributions to our understanding of several brain areas, all of them situated towards the vulnerable back of the brain. They included the primary visual cortex, the first sensory area in the cortex devoted to visual processing, the cerebellum, a key brain region for controlling balance and movement, and the parietal cortex. How Holmes managed to achieve this in the primitive and challenging conditions of a field hospital remains difficult to comprehend, but he had a reputation as a practicing neurologist for being both fast and thorough. Indeed, several aspects of the modern neurological examination can be traced back to his techniques. One of Holmes's important case series from this time were his observations on soldiers with loss of part of their sensory visual field. They literally could not see anything in a sector of their vision, even though their eyes were intact. The reason they were blind in part of their visual field was because a portion of their primary visual cortex, the part of the brain that receives signals from the eyes, had been damaged by a bullet which had passed through it. By mapping the visual field loss and correlating it with the path of the bullet, Holmes was able to establish not only that the primary visual cortex was right at the back of the brain, in the occipital lobe, but also how a map of the visual fields was represented. 14 Objects that appeared in the right visual field activated the primary visual cortex in the left hemisphere, while those in the left visual field stimulated the primary visual cortex in the right hemisphere. Holmes described another group of soldiers who were suffering from what he termed visual disorientation. These young men had injuries from bullets that had passed through the parietal lobes, sometimes entering one and exiting through the other side of the brain. 16 Superficially, they appeared to some people to be blind because they would stumble into objects, bump into people and not know where things were when asked to pick them up. But, as Holmes discovered when he examined them carefully. These soldiers weren't blind. They could see, though typically, when asked to touch an object, they might move their arm in the wrong direction and continue to grope for it, more or less like a man searching for a small object in the dark. Holmes demonstrated that his patients simply didn't know where objects were located in space, and some of them also suffered severe inattention. His descriptions are very similar to the patient Balint had described, with strokes affecting the left and right parietal cortex. Hence, nowadays, neurologists refer to the constellation of visual deficits that these pioneers reported as the Balint-Holmes syndrome. Others, too, were recording observations of curious symptoms as a result of parietal injury. German soldiers who were shot in the front lines of the First World War were examined by neurologists, such as Poppelreuter and Kleist.17. The latter introduced the term constructional apraxia to denote the impairments in copying three-dimensional constructions or drawings that parietal injuries led to. Later, towards the second half of the 20th century, it slowly became apparent to many neurologists that visual spatial syndromes, such as neglect and constructional apraxia, were far more common and more severe after right hemisphere than left hemisphere damage. 1819. Exactly why this should be the case remains to be established, but one explanation is that because the left hemisphere in human beings has become so specialized for speech and language, many other functions, particularly spatial ones, became localized in the right hemisphere. Winston came back to see me in the clinic a month later. He was dressed altogether differently. No suit on this occasion, but a slightly threadbare white shirt and some bottle green tracksuit bottoms, which seemed very incongruously put together for a smart dresser. Like him, I could see that he was still suffering from left-sided neglect. He had shaved the right side of his face neatly, but there was clearly untended gray stubble on the left, and on his left sleeve there were several yellowing stains, perhaps the vestiges of culinary endeavors over the last week. He looked despondent but tried to be upbeat. "What's up with you, Doc?" "I'm well, thanks, but how about you?" "Not doing too badly," he said, nodding his head in a very unconvincing style. "No, you're not having any difficulty?" "Well, we all got difficulties, man," he laughed. "Who doesn't? But after the stroke, I mean." "Ah well, yeah sure I did have a stroke, Doc." He was looking me straight in the eye, which was definitely an improvement since I'd last seen him. Previously, he would always be gazing off to his right. "Yes, I'm sure. Any reason to doubt it?" "Well, my friends doubt it." "How do you mean, Winston?" "Well, they say they haven't seen people with a stroke like me. Me walks fine, me talks fine, but I'm still bumping into people. My friends, they think there's something else going on. They're, how d'ya say, reluctant to go out with me. They don't say as much, but I can sense it." "I see," I nodded. "And what do you think about the stroke?" "I trust ya, Doc, but I don't seem to be getting any better." There was still a skeptical tone in his voice. "It's only been a couple of months since it happened, so it's still early days." "Really? Isn't there any medication or rehab for it?" "I'm afraid there isn't any licensed treatment for this neglect syndrome that you have, and at that time there weren't even any clinical trials that we could offer to recruit Winston into." Several years later, we were able to show that guanfacine, a drug that boosts the actions of the neurotransmitter noradrenaline in the brain, can significantly improve attention in some people with leftward neglect after their right hemisphere stroke. 20 Drugs that simulate the effects of dopamine in the brain can also boost attention in some patients. 22. So all I do is wait? A lot of people do get better over time. He nodded his head again. I changed the subject. We started to talk about Winston's background. He was one of the Windrush generation, so called because of the Empire Windrush, an ex-German cruise ship, which in 1948 traveled from Jamaica and other Caribbean islands, bringing some of the first migrants who were seeking work in the UK. The British government had actively encouraged people from across its former empire to move to the country, because there was a shortage of labor in post-war Britain. Winston had crossed the Atlantic in the 1950s. However, what soon became apparent to him and his compatriots was English people's hostility to black people. They were not welcomed with open arms. Whenever we went for a job, we'd be told it had just been filled. When we tried to find a place to live, people might just straight out say that they didn't take wogs, a racial slur, which many take to be a shortening of gollywog. Sometimes there were signs outside: no blacks, no Irish. Now, what chance did I stand when I'm both of those? Doc, he laughed. Yeah, no. Even when we did find a room to rent, the landlord would complain about the smell of our cooking. We don't want no darky food, they'd say. Like many others from the Caribbean, Winston had settled in Notting Hill, now a fashionable part of West London. At that time it was the very opposite. Exploitative landlords had carved out some of the old houses there into multi-occupancy flats, and because they were prepared to rent to black people, many people from the Caribbean in this wave of migration ended up living there. It was a part of London where illegal drinking and gambling, prostitution and drug dealing were rife. It was also the focus of festering tensions between the new migrant community and the locals. I was there when the big riot happened in '58. Winston recalled, "It was crazy, mad stuff with teddy boys attacking people in the street with iron bars and knives for no good reason. We had to fight back." He was talking about a group of young, suburban working class men who'd taken to wearing clothes based on Edwardian style fashion, hence Teddy. Although one of the interests of these Teds was rock and roll music, another seemed to be living a violent lifestyle which notoriously came into public view in the Notting Hill riots of late summer 1958 that Winston was referring to. These were triggered by an assault by a gang of white youths on a white Swedish woman who was married to a Jamaican. The suspicion was that the subsequent eruption of violence involved Oswald Mosley's far-right union movement and the White Defense League. Mosley, who had been interned for much of the Second World War for his fascist views, stood as a candidate for Member of Parliament in the 1959 general election in the Kensington North constituency, campaigning stridently on a platform of the forced repatriation of immigrants from the Caribbean. His manifesto included the prohibition of mixed marriages. In the end, he was unsuccessful, securing only 8% of the vote. In response to the racially motivated riots, an indoor Caribbean carnival, televised by the BBC, was arranged by Claudia Jones, a journalist and activist from Trinidad. This was the precursor to London's most famous street event, the Notting Hill Carnival. Winston was looking down at the floor. "It must have been a tough time for you." He looked up. "'Twas worse than tough, Doc. We felt lucky that we hadn't been lynched. Many's the time I thought about going back to Jamaica, but we hung on and things improved. I gotta say that." Winston's descriptions of Notting Hill brought back some images for me as a child growing up in West London in the 1960s. My first encounter with a lot of black people from the Caribbean was in Shepherd's Bush Market. Holding my mother's hand, I would walk tentatively with her across the Goldhawk Road towards this noisy, bustling arena, which my parents would insist on calling a bazaar. As We entered. We would be greeted by a cacophony of cries from the market sellers, "Come and get 'em, lovely apples. 2 and 6. Come and get 'em," all unfathomable to the ears of an immigrant child. Most of the people with stalls were white Londoners. But to one side of the market, there were the black Caribbean traders with okra, sweet potato, green bananas, and vivid varieties of fish that I'd never seen before. Red snapper, whiting, and mullet. Most of all, I still recall the exotic smell of curried goat being served by a guy sporting a trilby, shouting out for customers in an accent that was even more difficult for me to decode. I didn't know what he was saying, but I knew I wanted to taste his food. "Tell me about your friends," I prompted Winston. "Well, I got a few really good ones. I've known 'em since those days. We stick together." "Well, we did, but only Kelvin comes around nowadays." "You married?" "No, man, but I got a son. He lives in Smetiwick, up in Birmingham. Don't see much of him." "So, your friends don't think you've had a stroke?" "I'm not making it up. Ask Kelvin. He's out there in the waitin' room." "Oh, I hadn't realized he's here with you. Do you mind if I talk to him alone for a few minutes?" Winston agreed, and I guided him towards a seat in the waiting area where I also spotted his friend, who rose to shake my hand. "Good to see ya, Doc. And you, Kelvin. Thanks for coming with Mr. O'Hara. I couldn't do anything but. He needs help, Doc. He wouldn't, Avenue. Made it here on his own." I took him into the consulting room to speak to him alone. Everything about Kelvin's manner was gentle, restrained, and understated. Winston was obviously the extrovert of this partnership, Kelvin the quieter foil. "How's he doing back home in Notting Hill?" I asked. "He's far from right, Doc. Winston, ya know, is the life and soul of the party. He's the man we go to see for fun. He's what makes us laugh, but now, tell ya the truth, we get a little embarrassed goin' out with him. He's never safe on his own. The moment he starts to walk, he's always bumpin' into people or knocking things over. When he's eatin', he'll not notice that he's dropping food. Ya can see the stains on his shirt. His place is a tip 'cause he's not able to look after it. Like, that's not him. Him a very proud man. Some of Winston's friends have got a bit suspicious. Like, we never seen anything like that in people who had a stroke. Ya not hidden somethin' from him?" "How do you mean?" "Well, we got to talkin', his friends see, and we were tinkin' that maybe Winston has somethin' terrible that you're not tellin' him." There was a pause. I looked quizzically at Kelvin. "What do you mean?" I asked. "A long time ago, one of our neighbors, he was diagnosed with syphilis that had gotten to his brain. Even when he was an old man, he went a bit doolally. Something they called general paralysis or some such." I was a bit taken aback. Kelvin was referring to what in the 19th century had been called general paresis of the insane, a term that still remains in medical practice today. GPI, as it is now abbreviated to, is a late manifestation of untreated syphilis, characterized by progressive restlessness, decline in memory, personality change, and often delusions of grandeur. Patients with the condition are observed to slowly become unbalanced, weak, and tremulous before being unable to walk, and eventually dying bedridden. At one stage, up to 20% of men in British asylums in the late 19th century were given a diagnosis of GPI.23. Some have speculated that Robert Louis Stevenson's character Mr. Hyde was based on someone with GPI, although it wasn't established at the time that syphilis was the cause. The fact that most patients with the condition were men did not pass unnoticed. Finally, in the early 20th century, the discovery of the bacteria that caused syphilis In the post-mortem brains of patients who had suffered GPI left little doubt as to the cause. The discovery of penicillin had a major impact on treating the condition, provided it was not diagnosed too late. I knew that GPI comes on slowly over years, not suddenly as in Winston's case, so there was no reason to believe he had this condition. However, there was one complication. Sometimes syphilis infection in its intermediate stage can cause an inflammation of the blood vessels, including those in the brain, which in turn can lead to recurrent strokes. But Winston had not suffered multiple strokes. And our trainee Nikki, who was nothing if not extremely thorough, had asked for a syphilis test to be performed on the blood sample that Winston had given. Thankfully, it had been negative. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. But no, I haven't got any reason to think Mr. O'Hara has anything like that. Yaw sure now, Doc, 'cause that's partly the reason that some of our friends aren't seeing Winston. They're worried they might catch this disease. I ain't told him nothin', though. I looked at Kelvin in some surprise. This was totally unexpected for me. Let me bring him back into the room, I said, and perhaps I can show you both the stroke on his scan if he is happy for me to do that. Okay, let's do that. And so, I brought Winston back into the room and he agreed that it would be all right for Kelvin to see his brain scan with him. At least he'll believe I have a brain, he said and chuckled loudly. I logged into the radiology program and found Winston's CT scan. Here, you see the darkness here. That is the stroke, I said, pointing to the screen. You see the other side of the brain. The left side is normal. There is no darkness there. Darkness, yaw say, Winston mused as he looked at the scan. And that's my brain? Yes, all the scan shows is a stroke. The blood tests don't show you have any kind of infection either. If we control your blood pressure and you take aspirin, we can try to reduce the chances of you having any more strokes, Mr. O'Hara. And this problem I have, it's called neglect. That right? Yes. And many people do get slowly better over 6 months. And that's all there is, Doc? Kelvin inquired too, looking for reassurance. No infection, or nothin' like that. Absolutely no infection, I emphasized firmly. Funny ting, this neglect, ain't it a queer ting? Kelvin, anyone doing research on it? Winston asked. As a matter of fact, we're trying to understand what happens in people like you. Why you're not paying attention towards one side of space and missing things on that side. Really? I'm happy to help if you need me, Doc, Winston offered. Well, y'all don't want to be a guinea pig for research now though, Kelvin said, swiftly intervening. You wouldn't be a guinea pig, I promise. We'd do some special tests of your vision, attention and memory, and perhaps ask you to have another type of brain scan. I'd be up for that, so long as y'all look after me, Doc. Tilda. When Winston left, I couldn't help but think about his predicament. Here was a man who had been at the center of his Notting Hill group of friends, but now he was facing being ostracized because of his inattention and the suspicion that this wasn't due to a stroke but rather syphilis. I decided that we needed to get him involved in our research sooner rather than later, so that his friends would know that he was taking part in work that might help patients who had suffered a stroke. The next day I called Kelvin to see if we might arrange a taxi to pick Winston up and bring them both to the research center at the Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience at Queen Square. So, this is where the guinea pigs come, right, Doc? Winston smiled. No, this is where patients with stroke who have neglect come for our research studies. So, what y'all goin' to do me, Doc? None of that electrical stimulation I hope, he chuckled. I have had too much stimulation in My time. Let's take you to the brain scanner. I said. Now ya talkin'. We gonna get some fresh photos of my brain. Kelvin, bet you're jealous. And this research is for stroke patients. Right, Doc? Kelvin asked. Yes, just for stroke patients, I said emphatically. Nobody else. In the MRI scanner, Winston lay looking at a central cross while we flashed visual images either to the left or right of it. We got him to press a handheld button whenever he saw something. The scans of his brain revealed Winston's right parietal stroke. As previously, they also showed that the region of his primary visual cortex was intact in the right cerebral hemisphere, just as it was in the left. This explained why his visual fields were intact. Later, when we analyzed the activity in his brain, we found that whenever an image was flashed in his right visual field, it would activate the primary visual cortex in the left primary visual cortex. Similarly, when we presented an object in his left visual field, there was a response in his right primary visual cortex. We could tell that this occurred even on the occasions when Winston failed to be consciously aware of the image that we flashed in his left visual field. This type of finding was scientifically extremely important. It showed us that even though the visual cortex in the right hemisphere was activated by an object in the left visual field, this was not sufficient for conscious awareness of it. 24 Although his eyes saw an object to his left, and even when his primary visual cortex saw it too, Winston's left-sided neglect due to his right parietal stroke left him unable to perceive it consciously. He wasn't able to see this object. Thus, activation of the primary visual cortex is not sufficient for human beings to perceive with awareness. One possible conclusion from this sort of finding is that we need to be attending to something to be consciously aware of it. John Marshall and Peter Halligan, two Oxford neuropsychologists, provided further evidence for this. They asked a patient who, like Winston, suffered with left-sided visual neglect to look at drawings of two houses which were identical, except one of them had flames and smoke coming out of its left side. When asked if she noticed any difference between the two buildings, the patient reported that they were identical. She failed to notice that one of the houses was on fire because of her left-sided inattention. However, when she was requested to indicate which of the houses she would prefer to live in, she consistently chose the one which was not on fire. 25 Even though she was not consciously aware of the fire on the left side of one of the houses, and she did not report seeing it, this information had entered her brain and was biasing her choices subconsciously. Before Winston left the research center with Kelvin, he asked to say goodbye to me. That flashing stuff in the scanner, are you really telling me that helps you understand what's going on in my brain, Doc? He asked, obviously bemused. Yes, we hope so. Thanks for coming all this way to take part in this research, Mr. O'Hara. Without people like you being involved, we wouldn't be any the wiser. Please call me Winston, he insisted. And, Doc, y'all sure about there being no infection that's caused this? He asked once more. Is there something in particular you're worried about, Winston? Well, y'all know, one of our neighbors went a bit funny and it turned out he had syphilis. And people are putting 2 and 2 together and making 6 out of it. I see, I said, quietly recognizing it as the story Kelvin had told me. 2. We actually tested you for syphilis when you first came to hospital and it was negative. The scan doesn't show anything else suspicious on that front, so there's no need for you to worry about that. Y'all already tested me for syphilis. Winston beamed. Y'all crafty people. Well, y'all made my day, Doc. I waited a minute. Winston, I couldn't say this to your friend, but would it help if I Told him about the test result? Would I have your permission? If Kelvin heard it from me, he might be able to reassure your friends. You're brighter than you look. Doc, of course. Please do tell him. It would really help. So, I brought Kelvin over and explained. He was also very pleased. Well, that's a relief. Doc, if I can say that to our friends, that might make a little difference. And it did make a difference. Winston's friends were no longer anxious about catching anything from him. Although at times his inattention still rankled, they interpreted it as confusion and its manifestations in public meant that, to begin with at least, they were still unkeen to go out with him anywhere over the next 6 months. However, Winston's neglect slowly improved, as it often does in patients with stroke. Although it never fully resolved, it became possible for him to reconnect better with his circle of friends. He was able to go out with them, sometimes to the pub, where he no longer bumped into people or knocked over glasses, sometimes to a club, often to Portobello Market or the local park. He even managed to enjoy again the vibrant street life of the Notting Hill Carnival, an annual event that he had been to for over 30 years. We saw Winston a lot over subsequent years. He took part in a whole host of investigations on the functions of the parietal lobe in short-term memory, sustaining attention over time, and even directing eye and hand movements to objects at different spatial locations. Of all the patients I have seen, Winston contributed more than anyone to our research. And each time he came to see us, he would bring a different story from Notting Hill, the place he loved to belong to. 6. The woman who didn't care. Queen Square was looking eerily resplendent. Unusually, the winter sun had broken through the cloud cover in places, framing the barren trees in a soft pink light and imbuing the scene with a wondrous stillness. The overnight frost still held tight to the branches, etching them in a silvery ink. The gardens were serenely quiet. Moments like these in the heart of London are to be cherished, and as a treat I decided to sit down on a bench to absorb the atmosphere. A few feet away, a splendid red-throated robin, curious to inspect the newcomer, hopped closer to make my acquaintance, but was soon evidently satisfied that I offered little of interest. I was sure that he was about to fly off when we were both startled by shouts from the roadside. The peace was shattered. "I am not going to take that from you," I heard a high-pitched voice scream. "Madam, I'm very sorry, but you asked for a cappuccino and that's what I made. Do you know that you're an absurd specimen of a man? If we can call you that. This tastes like drain water. Not any old drain water, but one with foul, frothy scum on top. And you have the nerve to call it a cappuccino. It deserves to be in the bloody sewers." The voice echoed harshly through the stillness. Curious to see what was going on, I stood up to look through the garden gate. In front of a little van which was selling coffee stood a petite woman, no taller than 5 foot, perhaps in her late 50s. She was dressed in a suede pink cowgirl suit, with sparkling silver tassels. On her head was perched an oversized white Stetson, which was in danger of engulfing her entire face. On her feet she wore white high-heeled crocodile leather boots, embroidered with a lurid depiction of an alabaster serpent coiling upwards. It was an extraordinary sight. "I'm really very sorry, madam. I'll make you another one." "You must be joking. I don't want any more of this filth." With a flourish, she poured the milky contents of her paper cup straight into the gutter and marched off indignantly. Behind her, an apologetic man mumbled something to the barista, shrugged his shoulders and quickly followed his cowgirl companion. Thankfully, the shouting had ceased. Quietness had returned to the square. But my moment of enjoyment had been spoiled and I had a clinic to get to. The list that morning was busy. It started with me seeing a patient who had suffered from physical symptoms due to her multiple sclerosis for more than 3 decades. But now she was also evidently experiencing a decline in her memory. The question posed by her GP was whether her cognitive impairment could all be attributed to her multiple sclerosis, certainly a possibility, or whether she had unfortunately developed a second condition, such as Alzheimer's disease. We had to arrange neuropsychological testing and an MRI brain scan as the first set of tests to distinguish between these possibilities. Next, I had the difficult job of giving a man in his 60s the news that he probably had an unusual neurodegenerative condition called progressive supranuclear palsy. Neither he nor his family were expecting this. I therefore had to go beyond the time normally allocated for a consultation in order to explain more about the condition. As I was finishing the letter for this consultation, the clinic nurse entered my room, clearly flustered. "Are you ready to see your next patient?" she asked breathlessly. "Sure, but just give me 5 minutes to finish this letter. Would you mind leaving that until later? The next one on your list is creating a bit of a stir in the waiting room. They're extremely unhappy that you're running late." I looked at the clock above the door. "But I'm only 10 minutes over." "I know, but they're making our lives hell out there." I nodded. "Okay, bring them in." I put the dictaphone down. Patients had become so much more demanding over the years. I reflected. You might experience more than a 10-minute delay to see a hairdresser. Yet it was seemingly unacceptable when your appointment was to see a specialist doctor. Why such a fuss? When they came in, I realized the answer straight away. There stood the cowgirl and her companion from the squabble I had witnessed that morning. I took a deep breath in. "About bloody time. I'm Sue Ryland," she exploded. "Hello, I was starting to introduce myself, but she didn't give me a chance. "I don't care if you are sorry. You're late, and if there's one thing I cannot stand, it's people who are late," she interrupted. "Don't look at me like that. You doctors deserve to be told, just like everyone else. It's impolite to keep people waiting." She was genuinely livid, her white Stetson now in her hand. I could see her rounded face, framed by unnaturally jet black hair and expressing a deep rage which I did not really want to confront. I stayed quiet, waiting to see what would happen next. But it was he who unexpectedly spoke. "Hello, doctor. I'm very sorry. Please excuse Sue. She wouldn't normally behave in this way. That's part of the reason we're here to see you. I'm Alan, her husband." He was a short man too, but with a freckly face and thinning ginger hair. His wiry frame contorted stiffly with embarrassment as he apologized for his outspoken wife. "I see. Good to meet you both. Please do sit down," I responded, keeping my words to a minimum in an attempt not to inflame the situation further. I got the impression that saying anything might provoke Sue. She was now looking at Alan with exasperation, her focus turning away from me. "Charming. How dare you even think of apologizing for me? Alan. He's the one who should be saying sorry," she said, stabbing her finger in my direction. "He's the one who should apologize. Alan, not me." I waited again. "I really am sorry to have kept you waiting," I said. "I had to give some bad news to someone. I hope you'll understand. That can take longer than our normal appointments. But I'm seeing you now and will give you the time you need." "I should hope so," said Sue, suddenly bringing her feet off the floor to sit ankles crossed, with her crocodile boots perched on the edge of my desk. "I'm so sorry, Doctor." "Sue, please take your feet off the desk," implored Alan, clearly even more embarrassed. "Why? There's nothing wrong with it, and this doctor wants me to relax, don't you?" She smiled at me wickedly, fully sensing my awkwardness. That's fine with me, I said slowly, if you find it easier to speak with your feet up on the desk. I don't mind, by all means, Mrs. Ryland. See, he's all right with it. She nodded to Alan, who had a look of resignation on his face. You never know, he might be a bit of all right, too, she commented as an afterthought. Laughing out loud, Alan squirmed. Now Sue was a little calmer. I tried to take a history from her. Well, it's true what Alan says. I am different. I have changed, but it's all for the best. You know, I used to be one of those timid little housewives, but I've had enough of all that. The kids have grown up. Alan's close to retirement. I can just be myself now. I don't care what people think, she explained. I see. So how have you changed? I asked gently. Well, I do what I want. I don't have to pretend. She drummed a short tattoo with her fingers on the arm of her chair, in the way someone might if they were impatient. Give me an example. Where do I start? I've taken up line dancing. I never would have done that. Do you like my outfit? By the way, it's certainly very arresting, Mrs. Ryland, I commented. Thank you. I thought you doctors might appreciate being cheered up a bit. You're such stiff, gloomy people. Alan had suggested I wear something more boring, but it's nice to be valued, I find. Did you hear what he said, Alan? He likes it. Alan kept quiet, his eyes looking up to the ceiling as she continued. Then I've built a home cinema. Always wanted one, but everyone kept saying there was no space. So I've got it built in the garden. It's amazing, isn't it, Alan? Yes, we now have a home cinema in a shed in the garden. Doctor Sue insisted and we couldn't refuse. It's been magic. I watched some great movies in there. We've got surround sound and everything. Top notch. You can come if you behave. She drummed her fingers again. Thank you. Would people outside the family notice that you're different, Sue? I should bloody well hope so. I'm not being all meek and demure anymore. I just speak my mind. But there's nothing wrong with that. Doctor, there are too many things left unsaid in this world. And so it went on. Sue was insistent that she was just being herself after years of conforming, of playing the role expected of a mother and wife. I asked her to step out the room for a moment, so I might get the perspective of her husband, and she agreed, but not without a little reluctance. Don't you go telling any of your porky pies, Alan. I don't want this flirty doctor to get the wrong idea of me before we have a chance to hit it off, she said with a chuckle as she left. Is what she says correct? I asked Alan. Oh, it's true all right, doctor. Too true. When did things change? I first noticed about 2 years ago. We were walking down the high street and she saw this couple. He would have been in his 70s. She was in her 20s. He put his arm around the shoulder of the young woman to give her a hug. And before I knew it, Sue was shouting, "Filthy bugger, you should be ashamed of yourself, taking advantage of a young girl like that." They didn't know what to do. Both of them were very upset. He turned out to be her grandfather taking her out for a birthday lunch. Sue would never have shouted out in public like that in the past. But now she's commenting on everyone. The other day, she saw a woman across the road and called out, "You need to lose weight. Love, that dress is doing you no favors." That isn't my Sue, doctor. So, has her behavior got progressively worse over time? Oh, definitely. Much worse. What was she like before then? I asked. Well, you wouldn't believe it from what you've just seen. But she used to be a quiet, understanding person who everyone loved to talk to. The neighbors go indoors now if they see her coming down the road, because she can sometimes get very agitated. You know. Verbally aggressive. In the past, they'd chat to her for ages because she was always so helpful. To tell you the truth, I cringe being out with her. For example, this morning she gave this poor coffee seller such a hard time. He didn't know what hit him. I know. I saw it happen. I remarked. Did you? Really? Well then, you know what she's like. That's a prime example. But the worst one was 2 weeks ago. We were on the bus and there was nowhere to sit because it was so crowded. What does she go and do? She squeezes a young man's bottom, saying, "You'll go far, my lad." With an ass like that, he was shocked. He didn't know what to do but made sure he got off at the next stop. I wished I could have too. People were looking at me, disgusted, as if I was responsible. And then all Sue said to them as this young man got off the bus was, "What? Don't look at me like that. He does have beautiful buttocks." I could have died. And she never would have done that in the past. Oh, my goodness. No, she was prudish, if anything. So why did she say she'd done that on the bus? Her response was that there isn't enough plain speaking in the world. He was a very good-looking bloke. And she thought she'd show her appreciation. I mean, I ask you. And how is she with the family? Well, she used to be a really warm person. Very affectionate. Always hugging me and the children. Now she seems, well, very disengaged. Quite cold. She doesn't seem interested. Never seems to show any feelings or emotions when there's good or bad news. For example, our daughter had her first baby. He's our first grandchild. 2 months ago, Sue didn't show a flicker of interest. I had to insist that we go to visit our daughter after the baby was born. Must we? There's a good film on the television tonight. She says. Can you believe that? This is our first grandchild. Sue doesn't seem to care if she upsets people either. The other day, our daughter was crying on the telephone because she wasn't coping with the baby. And Sue just told her to get a grip. We've all had to deal with it. She said, I can't be doing with any moaning or dramas now. You're not the first woman to have a baby. And she just put the phone down. She no longer seems to understand people, even her own family. She lacks, what's the word? Empathy? I offered. That's it. She lacks empathy. How else has she changed? How hasn't she changed? Blurted Alan in exasperation. She told you about the home cinema. None of us wanted it except for her. We don't have any space. But she insisted, even when the children were against it. She'd never have done that in the past. Now we have a huge shed that takes up most of our garden where she disappears to watch movies. Is she a big film buff? No, Alan shook his head in bemusement. That's what caught us by surprise. But she says that she never had the courage to say what she wanted before. It's all beyond me. Is she doing anything else that is out of character? Huh, he sighed. Well, in the last 2 years, she has bought 8 different bikes. Why so many? That's just it. Why so many? She insists she needs a different bike for different situations. You know, a mountain bike, a racing bike, a folding bike, and, would you believe it, a tandem was her latest purchase. And she hardly rides any of these bikes. And how's her memory? Sharp as a button. It's better than mine. She doesn't forget. But she is now so much more disorganized. Sometimes she'll start to do something in the house, like reorganizing the kitchen cupboards. But then she'll get distracted and go off to do a bit of gardening. But before she's finished that, she might go off to the computer to order something we don't need, leaving the kitchen and garden in a mess. She'd never do that before. And is there anything else that you think is important that we haven't talked about? Alan suddenly looked very embarrassed. I gave him time. There is one thing, he said awkwardly. I waited. A few weeks ago, We were in the supermarket. I'd gone off to get some milk or something, and when I was walking up to Sue from behind, I saw that she was putting chocolate bars into her handbag. 4 or 5 of them. She was going to shoplift them. And I wouldn't have known anything about it. She didn't even seem to feel guilty when I fished them out and put them into our shopping trolley. She would have been mortified if she'd been caught doing that kind of thing in the past. All these changes in Sue's behavior were, understandably, extremely concerning to Alan. She would blurt out what she thought. She acted impulsively. Sometimes she could be verbally aggressive. She lacked empathy, had poor judgment, seemed to be chaotic in how she did simple everyday things at home, and had even been caught in the act of shoplifting but showed no remorse. The only other thing he could think of was that she had developed a habit of repeatedly drumming on a table with her fingers. You mean like she was doing in this room? Yes, he agreed with a nod. But that was mild. At home she can keep repeating this over and over again. It's annoying. Is there any family history of anything similar? Not as far as I know. Her mom and dad are in their 80s and they're doing well. She has 2 older brothers and a younger sister. None of them have anything like this. And how is Sue's relationship with them and her friends? Awful. Just awful. She's had rows with her parents and one of her brothers over silly stuff, like politics of all things. She's become so rigid in her views. She has no tolerance. She can't stand anyone saying a kind word about immigrants or gay people, or anyone she thinks is different really. She never was like that. Her brother won't speak to her after she was rude to him about his wife. As for friends, we hardly see anyone nowadays. She's even managed to upset a few of my old mates, so they won't come around to our house. I have to meet them elsewhere. Frankly, she's become a nightmare. I brought Sue back into the room. The neurological examination I performed did not reveal any abnormality, but she was not too happy about undergoing the process. As if tapping a few reflexes is ever going to tell you anything. She observed. The cognitive testing screen I performed didn't show very much either, except that her verbal fluency, the ability to think of words beginning with a letter of the alphabet in a minute, was reduced. However, just as my conversation with Alan had indicated, her episodic and semantic memory were both very good, as was her attention and visual spatial function. I think we'll have to move to a scan of the brain and some deeper tests of your cognitive functions with our neuropsychologist. I explained. Well, that is a surprise, Sue responded sarcastically. And what if those are normal, too? You'll have to say there isn't anything wrong with me. I'm a liberated woman. Doctor, that's going to be your diagnosis. Tilda. It was a relief when Sue finally left. She had been quite exhausting. It had been challenging to keep calm in the face of some of her provocative remarks. I had felt myself getting very irritated, occasionally even a little angry, throughout the consultation. That was telling in itself. Few people have the power to cause such an emotional response in most of us. But Sue could do it. Although, apparently she had not behaved like this 2 years ago. Fig. 13. Frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is the largest lobe of the human brain. Her behavior was highly characteristic of patients with what has been termed the frontal lobe syndrome. People with injury to their frontal lobes, Fig. 13, can become very different in their behavior. This was first appreciated in the famous case of Phineas Gage. 1. A foreman who was working with his men in September 1848 on the construction of the Rutland and Burlington Railroad in Vermont. Gage was preparing to blast a hole through a rocky outcrop by compacting gunpowder that he had poured into a hole in the rock with a tamping rod. Unfortunately, The powder exploded, and the force sent the metal rod flying straight through his skull. He was lucky to survive, but his subsequent progress was extremely stormy. He required surgery for a brain abscess and was fortunate enough to be attended by Dr. John Harlow, a New England doctor, who had the experience to perform this. Although Gage survived, his personality was profoundly altered. From being a responsible, upright man in his local community, he became an irritable, impatient person, prone to swearing and unreliable at work, sometimes obstinate and rigid in his views, and at other times highly capricious or vacillating in his judgments. He could seem callous and aggressive. His friends no longer considered him to be the same person they had known. Unable to hold down his previous job, Gage moved to Chile, but when his health began to decline, he returned to the States, eventually dying from a prolonged seizure in 1860 in San Francisco. When Harlow found out about his unusual patient's demise, he persuaded Gage's family to have the body exhumed so he could examine the skull. This showed the entrance and exit hole of the tamping iron as it had passed through the frontal lobe of the unfortunate man's brain. It is still viewable in the collection at Harvard Medical School today. The publication of Gage's case led to his importance as the first well-documented individual with behavioral changes after frontal lobe injury. Since that time, there have been many descriptions of the effects of frontal dysfunction on people's personalities and behavior. Patient EVR, for example, reported by Esslinger and Damasio in 1985, was a high-achieving professional. He was made chief accountant of his firm when he was only 29.2 at the age of 35. He was diagnosed as having a very large, slowly growing benign brain tumor called a meningioma. This was resected surgically, but although the operation was successful, EVR appeared very different. Afterwards, impulsively, he invested all his savings into a risky venture and soon became bankrupt. Subsequently, he drifted through several different jobs, including working as a warehouse laborer and building manager, but was fired from all of these. Employers complained about his poor timekeeping and disorganization. Apparently, he might take 2 hours to get ready for work. Some days were spent entirely on shaving and washing his hair. If he was planning to have dinner out at a restaurant with friends, it took him hours to decide where to sit or to select something from the menu. Frustrated and unable to cope, his wife left with their children. Divorcing him after 17 years of marriage, he moved in with his parents. Within a month of his separation, he remarried against the advice of relatives, only to divorce again 2 years later. Despite the clear alteration in his behavior, when tested on the standard cognitive tests that were available at that time, EVR performed very well. This led many researchers to conclude that those tests did not directly capture some of the functions of the frontal lobes that are evident in the day-to-day lives of patients like him. Some individuals with frontal lobe dysfunction might be very impulsive or disinhibited when they interact with other people. Sometimes they are rude or overfamiliar, as appeared to be the case in Sue. Others can become very withdrawn and lack initiative due anything. Some become highly rigid and inflexible in their thinking. Sue apparently showed some of this in her behavior. Some patients have difficulty following instructions, learning new rules, or solving relatively simple problems, such as how to use a device like a television remote control. Acquaintances might comment that they no longer seem able to coordinate activities or multitask, or they might experience difficulties planning ahead or deciding on which action to prioritize if they have many things to do. Some may become highly distractible, unable to stay on task. Some patients become socially or emotionally inappropriate. For example, No longer empathizing with others, or being able to see things from another person's point of view, as also appeared to be the case in Sue. The precise constellation of symptoms can differ widely between patients. The myriad of behavioral changes that can occur in the frontal lobe syndrome has been extremely puzzling to neuroscientists. Hans Lucas Teuber, professor of psychology at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, famously referred to this perplexing collection of symptoms in 1964 as the riddle of the frontal lobe. Point 3. The frontal lobes and the functions attributed to them still remain something of a mystery. If you ask any neurologist, neuroscientist, or psychologist what the frontal lobes do, you will receive a different answer from each, but somewhere at the heart of all their responses will probably lie the concept of control. Point 4. Since the very early descriptions of the consequences of frontal lobe injury, control has often dominated discussions on the topic, so much so that some researchers have proposed that one way to think of what the frontal lobe does is to imagine that it acts almost analogously to the chief executive of a company. Point 5. According to this view, it makes decisions, formulates goals, plans ahead, initiates actions, or stops ongoing ones if it realizes that these are ineffective. If necessary, it might switch to a different strategy to solve a problem. It keeps us focused on the task at hand, coordinates our actions, and multitasks over time. It considers how other people view a situation and, if appropriate, empathizes with them. It grasps social context and acts accordingly. It may elect to persuade or cajole others when necessary. From this perspective, the frontal lobe plays a critical role in what has been termed executive control, sometimes also referred to as cognitive control, supervising or coordinating the activities of the rest of the brain in pursuit of the overarching goals it wants to achieve. Point 6. David Baudre, a cognitive neuroscientist at Brown University, argues that in order to achieve a particular aim, the brain needs to have a mechanism to bridge the gap between knowing something about the world, knowledge, and achieving the goal it aspires to achieve through performing the appropriate actions for a particular context. Point 4. He observes that some patients with frontal dysfunction fail to achieve their goal even when they can say what they want to achieve, connecting, or crossing the bridge between knowledge and executing the relevant actions. Baudre proposes is what frontal control systems allow us to do in a flexible manner. They allow us to plan and select, to create a sequence of actions, and also to monitor the consequences of our behaviors for ourselves, as well as their impacts on other people. In fact, Baudre goes further to argue that the frontal lobe is crucial to successful anticipation of the consequences of our actions. If we foresee that a particular strategy is likely to be unsuccessful in a particular context, we might not execute it. For example, making a joke at someone's expense in a group might be perfectly acceptable when out socially with colleagues, but it may not be appropriate within the same group when discussing an important project in a meeting at work. Different parts of the frontal lobe may play selective roles in the hierarchy of control, from creating a goal to considering the particular context in which it has to be performed, through to executing the actions required to achieve that goal in that situation. Point 7. 8. The impulsive, disorganized, and chaotic behavior of individuals with frontal lobe dysfunction has been referred to as the dysexecutive syndrome because of the seeming lack of executive control over behavior. It's as if the chief executive officer or controller of a large organization is no longer making good decisions over what the company, in this case the person, should do, even if frontal lobe patients have the knowledge of what they want to achieve. Their execution of actions to reach their goal can be inappropriate or poorly judged. Many elements of Sue's decision making and disinhibited interactions with people were consistent with such a syndrome. Some researchers, such as the neurologist Antonio Damasio, have also demonstrated that patients with frontal lobe damage may not show emotional responses. They can also lack the physiological changes that occur with emotional reactions, such as alterations of skin conductance, an index of sweating. This bodily response has classically been used in the polygraph lie detector test and, although not fully reliable for discriminating truthful responses from lies, it has also been used in neuroscience research as a marker of when the body displays an emotional response which might not be apparent overtly. For example, although we can show our emotions when we smile, laugh, or frown, many of our emotional responses are covert, so other people might not be aware how we feel in a particular situation. People with frontal dysfunction can lack both facial expressions of emotion and the associated physiological bodily changes that occur in emotional situations. Damasio proposed that the behavioral changes in these individuals result from their inability to use emotional responses, which they have learned from previous experiences, to help guide their future behavior. Point 9. When presented with moral dilemmas, some patients with frontal damage are also seemingly indifferent to the emotional content of scenarios. For example, in the classic trolley problem, people are asked to imagine a runaway trolley heading down the tracks towards 5 workmen who will be killed if the trolley keeps going. They are told that they are standing on a footbridge over the tracks. Between the approaching trolley and the 5 workmen, next to them on the footbridge is a stranger, who happens to be very large. The only way to save the lives of the workmen is to push this stranger off the bridge and onto the tracks below, where his large body will stop the trolley. He will die if this occurs, but the 5 workmen will be saved. Would you push the stranger off under these circumstances? This is clearly an emotional scenario, but if we were considering it from a very rational, utilitarian perspective, i.e., what would be for the greater good, we might say that it would be worth sacrificing 1 person instead of 5. However, most healthy people balk at endorsing such a course of action and say that they would not do it. It is presumed that this is because it would entail inflicting harm on someone who is blameless and that this is morally unacceptable. But some patients with frontal damage more often choose the utilitarian response, electing to throw the unknown stranger off the bridge. Point 10. They seem to lack the emotional response to moral dilemmas that normally prevents most of us from selecting this course of action. Damasio also found that in rare patients who acquired frontal damage when they were babies, e.g., following a road traffic accident or a brain tumor that needed to be operated on, behavior can be so antisocial as they grow into adults that it emulates that of psychopaths. Point 11. They can show a pervasive disregard for social and moral standards, may behave consistently in an irresponsible manner, and lack remorse. They seem not to have learned conventions of social behavior and, as a result, they have very few friends. If people acquire a frontal disorder in adulthood, they are usually not quite so extreme in their behavior, but they can act inappropriately in social contexts. One important feature of their interactions with other people is an impaired ability to see things from someone else's perspective. They may lack what has been called a theory of mind, or the capacity to understand other people's mental states, their intentions, motivations, emotions, or thoughts. Point 12. Without such an appreciation and ability to control responses, they can blurt out the first thing they think about, regardless of how this might be received by someone else. This also seemed consistent with Sue's behavior. Her relationships with her family, friends and neighbors had all been scarred by her corrosive manner. But what was causing her frontal dysfunction? Sometimes people develop behavioral changes like Sue's in their 50s or 60s as a result of a psychiatric condition that comes on without any previous similar history. But this is unusual, because her symptoms had progressively worsened over 2 years. It also remained a possibility that they were due to a slowly growing frontal tumor, such as the meningioma that patient EVR was found to have. So I asked for her MRI scan and neuropsychology to be performed relatively quickly. Sue and Alan came back to see me 2 weeks later. This time, Alan had persuaded her not to wear the cowgirl outfit, but she arrived instead in shorts and sandals. It was January and freezing cold. As she entered, she pointed to an article in the newspaper she was carrying. "You see this, doctor? Just as I said to Alan a few months ago. Angela Merkel's decision to let all those Syrian refugees into Germany is coming unstuck. Some of them are being arrested for touching up young women in Cologne on New Year's Eve. Disgusting. She should never have let any of them in. It's just the start of a huge problem." I knew better than to argue. The backlash had begun against the Syrian refugees who had been welcomed into Germany only the previous year, over 4 years since the beginning of the civil war in Syria. Judgments were being made and voiced on the basis of the criminal actions of a few of them. "What, you don't have an opinion? All quiet, are we, doctor? Please do sit down. Let's discuss your scan and neuropsychology test results, shall we? This is far more important than my scan. Doctor, this Syrian refugee stuff is a crucial moment in history. You mark my words." Rather presciently, Sue proved to be right. But it was not the appropriate time to start a discussion on how immigration from Syria might have a profound impact upon Europe, which it subsequently did. I brought up her brain scan on the computer monitor and took them both through the images, describing what they showed. The scan had not revealed a tumor, I explained, but it wasn't normal either. "Well, I'd hate to be normal." Sue smirked. "Nobody wants to be average, doctor, do they?" She drummed her fingers on the desk. "I suppose not. You see here, in the front of the brain and also to some extent the temporal lobes on the side, they look reduced in volume compared to other parts of the brain. They seem to have shrunk." "And what might be the cause of that?" asked Alan. "The most likely cause is an illness called behavioral variant frontotemporal dementia, which dementia? I'm not demented, doctor," Sue interrupted. "I've got a great memory, haven't I, Alan?" Alan nodded. I continued. "There are many types of dementia, Mrs. Ryland. People with behavioral variant frontotemporal dementia can have very good memories, but their behavior can change in the way that seems to have happened in you. They can start to act differently." Alan looked shocked as he said, "So, if the front part of the brain shrinks, people can behave like Sue?" I nodded. "I'm afraid so." "What causes it, then?" he asked. "Sometimes there's a genetic cause, but that seems unlikely in Mrs. Ryland, given there isn't anyone else in the family who has been similarly affected. It seems that abnormal proteins can be deposited in the brain and they can cause nerve cells not to function properly." "Really? Proteins in the brain can do that, doctor?" Sue asked with irony, suddenly curious but nevertheless very agitated, her eyes wide open. "Proteins in the brain can make you behave differently. Can they? I've never heard such nonsense," she fumed. "I'm afraid so. And your neuropsychology test results would also be consistent with dysfunction of the frontal parts of the brain. The tests had confirmed that she was impaired on those cognitive Tests that require people to suppress their immediate response, or switch from one feature to another, such as switching between letters and numbers when searching for items, or multitasking. As we had found in clinic, Sue's episodic and semantic memory seemed intact, and similarly her visual-spatial functions were unimpaired. There was no evidence of limb apraxia. Our neuropsychologist had also performed some tests of moral cognition, such as the trolley problem. 10, and these had revealed that Sue was far more likely to choose the more logical, utilitarian course of action, even if that would mean directly causing physical harm to someone. Intriguingly, like other patients with behavioral variant frontotemporal dementia, she had a good sense of what was right and wrong. But when it came to making decisions where there were moral dilemmas, the emotional content of those scenarios did not affect her decision. Making. 13. Oh well, there we are, Alan. You're going to have to look after me. From now on, I want the full pampering treatment. Thank you very much, doctor. And with that she headed for the door. Alan, are you coming? Perhaps we might talk about treatment before you go. Treatment? I don't need treatment, doctor. I'm being myself, no matter what your scans show. Remember, I'm a liberated woman, she concluded as she slammed the door after her. Sue's responses were not a complete surprise. I had anticipated it. Wouldn't be an easy consultation. Alan stayed behind. Is there really some kind of treatment she could try? He inquired. Hopefully. There isn't a cure, but there is something that might help to reduce the agitation and the aggressive, impulsive behavior. It's called trazodone. And how does that work? We're not quite sure. It was developed for depression, but it's also been shown to improve some of the behavioral symptoms in people with frontotemporal dementia. It changes the balance of chemicals in the brain. Might it stop her getting worse? I'm afraid this is a progressive condition, as you've seen over the last couple of years, but it might help with some of the behavioral issues, at least for a time. I'd like her to try it. Please, doctor. Of course, but we first need to get her to accept that there is something wrong and that the medication might be useful for her. I'll talk with her sister and get her to come over, Alan said. Sue might listen to her and give it a go. She's the only one in her family who is still talking to her. So, I wrote a prescription for trazodone and wondered whether Sue would ever contemplate taking the drug. I can call her to explain about the drug if she is interested to try it. As I walked across the square that afternoon, I could not help but reflect on my second encounter with Sue. She was difficult to forget. The sun hung low in the sky, making the elongated shadows of the bare trees stretch across the expanse of gray grass. Winter was in full swing, and Sue had arrived at the clinic in summer apparel, oblivious to her surroundings or what people thought. I smiled at the barista in his coffee van. He was still there. I wondered if he had also had the pleasure of a reacquaintance with Sue that day. Behavioral variant frontotemporal dementia, abbreviated by neurologists to BVFTD, accounts for between 10 and 20% of dementia cases, but it is often an underdiagnosed condition. Because behavioral changes are often the most prominent signs, patients may be referred in the first instance to a psychiatrist. At that stage, brain scans, if they are performed at all, may appear to be normal, so a neurodegenerative condition might be ruled out. A definitive diagnosis may then take many years to establish. When it is made, it is most often given to people who are between 45 and 65 years old, but recent research reveals that the prevalence of BVFTD increases in even older people. The characteristic features of the illness include a host of different symptoms: impulsive or disinhibited behavior, loss of empathy, lack of motivation, change in dietary preference, often with the development of a sweet tooth, and lack of insight, with relative preservation of memory, visual spatial function and praxis. Sue showed many of these attributes. Her story even included an incidents of shoplifting that Alan had managed to scupper. But some patients with BVFTD can become involved in far more dangerous criminal activities and antisocial behavior. More than a third of individuals with the diagnosis commit crimes ranging from traffic violations, trespassing and theft through to indecent behavior, willful damage of property, burglary, physical assault and sexual harassment. 14 These and other transgressions of social norms inevitably place huge pressures on their family members. Their predicament is compounded by the indifference and lack of empathy shown by many individuals with BVFTD. There is evidence of both a loss of emotional empathy and cognitive empathy in the condition. Emotional empathy is the capacity to have emotional reactions to how other people are feeling, sharing a fellow feeling with another person. Cognitive empathy, on the other hand, is a term used to capture the ability to see a situation from somebody else's perspective and understand how they feel. The loss of both types of empathy has been related to atrophy of parts of the frontal and right temporal lobe. 15. A common observation of family members is that BVFTD patients are emotionally detached, cold, and show little eye contact. They may make hurtful or insensitive comments, mock a person's appearance, or show disregard for someone's pain or distress. Inevitably, this can lead to their exclusion from their social circles, and, eventually, even from their families. They become isolated. It sounded as if within 2 years Sue was a long way down the road to becoming socially excluded. Would trazodone make any difference? The drug was originally developed as an antidepressant. It works differently to modern SSRI drugs, which selectively inhibit the reuptake of serotonin, a neurotransmitter, at synapses, the connections between neurons. In this way, SSRIs act to increase the level of serotonin within the brain. Trazodone's major effects are thought to rely on blocking the action of a particular receptor for serotonin, thereby suppressing its activation. Overall, trazodone is not only effective in treating depression but can also improve some of the behavioral symptoms of dementia, including the irritability, agitation and dietary changes that occur in BVFTD. 16 Recently, the Cambridge neurologist and neuroscientist Giovanna Malucci has provided evidence that trazodone may, at the right doses, also have a protective effect on the brain across many neurodegenerative conditions by acting on an important protein regulation pathway within neurons. 17 I wasn't sure, though, whether we'd see any change in Sue, or even if she'd take the medication. 2 months later I received an email from Alan. Would it be possible for me to see Sue earlier than planned? He would really appreciate the opportunity to discuss a few things with me. That did not sound promising, but I overbooked my next clinic list to see if I might be able to help. On this occasion, I was surprised. To begin with, Sue was dressed normally, dare one say appropriately, for a clinic appointment. I felt so conformist for even thinking in this way. She had come in a warm coat over a smart dark blue trouser suit. Alan, too, looked less put upon than on our previous meetings. "Hello, doctor, and how are you?" asked Sue. She'd never asked me that before, so I wasn't sure where this conversational gambit was going to go. But I responded in traditional British style. "I'm fine, Mrs. Ryland. And what about you?" "Well, I was never feeling bad, as I told you." She smiled. "That's good to hear. Did you try the trazodone? By the way, that's really one reason we're here. Alan explained. I waited. Sue was persuaded by her sister and you. Thank you for the call. To start the medication. I do listen to Polly. I know that if anyone has my interests at heart, she does. Sue interrupted, drumming her fingers once again on the desk. It didn't look like a great deal had changed. And we have been able to increase the dose as you suggested. Alan said, completing his sentence. And, I asked. And we've come early to see if we could up the dose again, he said. Because? I looked at them both inquiringly. Because I think it has done some good. Sue's far less. How shall we say? Outspoken, and now she gives people an opportunity to explain their point of view. She's less likely to get angry or agitated with me or members of the family. So that's been really good. But obviously it hasn't changed everything, as you can sort of see for yourself. I was pleasantly surprised. Would you agree? I asked Sue. Well, as I said, I felt fine anyway, but Polly explained that I might be getting a little carried away with myself at times, perhaps arguing too much. So if it's working and can help me keep in touch with my family, I'm happy to continue it, so long as you're not slowly poisoning me, doctor. She laughed, jabbing her index finger in my direction. I smiled awkwardly. No, we're not doing that, but have you noticed any side effects? Are you feeling drowsy during the day? For example? Not that I've noticed. I do sleep better, but that's all I've been aware of. The family's noticed a big difference in how Sue's behaving. Doctor, obviously, they were shocked by the diagnosis. But now we have an explanation of why she's acting this way. Everyone's far more understanding. So, thanks for fitting us in today. Would we be able to try a higher dose? I've read we could go up further. Of course, we can try slowly increasing the dose. But did you say you wanted to discuss something else? Sue, I just want to talk to the doctor on his own. Would that be all right? Alan asked, turning to Sue. Of course, darling. You ask him what you like, she responded and gently walked out of the consulting room without a fuss. I nodded my head, impressed. I see what you mean. There has been some improvement. Yes, she's just not quite so wild or aggressive anymore. Thank you for trying the trazodone. It has been really helpful. I wanted to ask you how this will progress. How long have we got and how will she be over the next few years? We see a lot of variation. I told Alan. Some people progress very slowly. Others are more rapid. It's difficult to predict, but we'll get a sense of how things are going by assessing her over the next few years. I'm asking partly because the family would like to plan ahead if possible, and partly because we need to decide about whether this is the right time to obtain lasting power of attorney. Alan explained. In the UK, a person is deemed to have mental capacity to make decisions until otherwise proven, and they need to have such capacity to give lasting power of attorney for their property and affairs, or for their personal welfare, to someone else. But making an assessment of someone's capacity is not always straightforward. Even if they perform well on a cognitive screening test, as Sue had done, they may nevertheless not have capacity. Formally, to have capacity, a person must be able to understand information relevant to making a decision, retain it for the time required to make the decision, weigh up or evaluate the information to make the decision, and be able to communicate what they decide. Sue's ability to evaluate information to make decisions had clearly not been good. I see. Look, as we seem to be getting some success with trazodone, I think it would be best if we assess her formally with respect to capacity after a few months on the higher dose. I suggested she might receive some more benefits and may perhaps show better decision making. All right, doctor, that seems like a good idea. It's just that I don't want to get to a situation where she couldn't make the decision about lasting power of attorney herself. Alan responded. Have you discussed it with her? Not yet. I think it would be good to start that process at home. Gently of course, perhaps you might do this with Polly since she seems to listen to her? I knew, however, that it was going to be a big ask, because Sue really didn't seem like she would be interested in handing over control on decisions about her finances to someone else, no matter how much they might have her best interests at heart. I brought Sue back into the consulting room. All done, Alan? She asked, smiling mischievously. Said what you needed to? He's only trying to do what's in your best interests in. I began. I know, doctor, and so are you. It's just that I see things differently sometimes. Not today. You'll both be relieved to hear. She laughed. You're safe. For today, Alan. That's a relief to hear. I said, far too quickly for comfort. Who said you don't have a sense of humor? Doctor, did you hear that, Alan? He could be a comedian. This guy. A broad smile crossed Alan's face as he stood up to take his leave. Sue, still giggling, flicked his thinning hair playfully and threaded her arm through his. He turned back and raised his hand to say goodbye. As he left, pulled along by his wife. It had been very encouraging to see that trazodone had made a positive impact on Sue's erratic behavior. With higher doses, she continued to improve. She became less agitated. Some people even enjoyed her approach to plain speaking in conversation. When it was not accompanied by aggressive comments, Sue could seem extremely charismatic and funny. However, she never did consent to power of attorney. She was not going to budge on that, regardless of what anyone said. Inevitably, several years on, we reached a point when even trazodone could not hold back the impact of a progressive neurodegenerative disease on her behavior. Of all the individuals described in this book, Sue might be considered the one with the most dramatic change in her self and identity. The alterations that occur in behavior and personality in people with BVFTD are among some of the most dramatic that are observed in neurological patients. The disease can cause enormous distress to families, friends, and even to their doctors, largely because people with the condition repeatedly transgress the boundaries of what is considered acceptable behavior within society. They break the rules, but occasionally their directness can also be highly appreciated.